You right? Thanks. Microphone down. Welcome to the initial public hearing for the inquiry into budget estimates 2022-23. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians on the lands on which we are meeting today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I welcome President Matthew Mason-Cox from his world tour and accompanying officers to this hearing. Today the committee will examine the proposed expenditure for the portfolio of the Legislature. Before we commence, I would like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. Today's hearing is being broadcast live via the Parliament's website. Proceedings are also being recorded and transcript will be placed on the committee once it becomes available. In accordance with broadcasting guidelines, media representatives are reminded they must take responsibility for what they publish about the committee's proceedings, especially as they relate to Balmoral Castle. All witnesses in budget estimates have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time or with certain documents to hand. In these circumstances, witnesses are advised that they can take a question on notice and provide an answer within 21 days. If witnesses wish to hand up documents, they should do so through the committee. And Mr. President, I remind you that officers accompanying you that you are free to pass notes and refer directly to your advisors seated at the table behind you. And finally, could everyone please turn their mobile phones to silent for the duration of the hearing. All witnesses will be sworn prior to giving evidence. Mr. President, I remind you that you do not need to be sworn, as you have already sworn an oath to your office of Parliament. For all other witnesses, I ask that you each in turn state your full name, position, title and agency, and to swear either an oath or an affirmation. The words of both the oath and the affirmation are on the cards on the table in front of you. Please can we begin with the first witness on my left, Mr. David Blunt.
David Michael Blunt, Clerk of the Parliaments and Clerk of the Legislative Council. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you.
Mark Webb, Chief Executive, Department of Parliamentary Services. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Ms. Webb.
Jocelyn Dale Webb, Director, Financial Services and Governance, Department of Parliamentary Services. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Okay, thank you. Today's hearing will be conducted from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. with a 15-minute break at 11 a.m. for banana break. During this session, there will be questions from the opposition, crossbench and government members. Thank you for your attendance today, and we will begin with questions from the opposition.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, it's been 3.5 weeks now since the Broderick report was released, and the Parliamentary Executive Group would have been made aware of the draft findings and the recommendations of the report prior to the release. The Parliamentary Executive Group did make a statement on the day of the release. The question is, does the Parliamentary Executive Group plan to make a fulsome recommendation by recommendation response to the report?
Oh, absolutely. Work has already started in relation to working through an implementation process and an appointment of internal sort of staff to look at the report and the recommendations, to work up implementation sort of task force, which will be going through each of the recommendations, and obviously from there there'll be a process where the PEG will engage with the Parliamentary Advisory Group, which are a very key part of the process to date, as well as with other stakeholders in Parliament, and indeed the leadership of political parties. And in that regard, I recently received a letter from the Premier offering his assistance in that regard, and the intention obviously is to engage, as is recommended in the report, so far as dealing with each of the political parties to ensure that this most important issue is addressed, the security and safety and welfare of our staff are fundamental to the ongoing performance in here as a Parliament.
I
That's certainly the
appreciate
highest
that,
commitment
Mr.
we have.
President. Thank you. Can I ask what the time frame of the response would be?
The time frame is as soon as practicable. I mean, that issue is obviously...
Because in parliamentary timelines, that could be by the time we're in government.
Well, look, the internal work has begun in that regard, and in terms of I'd probably get an update in terms of where the internal work is.
I think that's important because
I
people
might just
are watching
ask the
this.
Chief Executive
Thank
Officer
you,
to give us an
President.
update on that. I'd certainly assure you before I ask Mr Webb to respond that this has the utmost priority from the Parliamentary Executive Group, and the response will be as quickly as possible and indeed engaging with all the key stakeholders in that regard. So with those few words, Mr Webb, would you like to respond in terms of the timing so far as the departmental implementation process is concerned?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. President. You will have noted from the report that there are 6 categories of recommendations and 53 sort of sub-points within those categories, and some of those sub-points can be divided a little further because they cover, for instance, recommendations to the Parliament's administration and recommendations to, say, political leadership in the one recommendation. So they could be split further into that area. So I have someone looking through all of the recommendations at the moment to translate that into the key points for action. Mr. Buttigieg, you mentioned before that we had access to draft findings. Not so much draft findings. We got the report very close to when it was released, but we did, you might recall from the last estimates that we did have Ms. Broderick review some of the policies early, did a sort of phase 1 where she reviewed the policies. So we have started working on the policies, put together drafts that we can put out for consultation.
Oh, so I apologise, Mr. Webb. So there were actually no draft findings released early. You just got the report early.
We got it a few days before the report went out. That final version. We obviously were checking through for things like typos or if there were misunderstandings about the Parliament or whatnot. Looking through for those. Which we provided that input. But we did get some early feedback on the policy suite that we have, our grievance handling policy, our harassment policy, and you would have seen from the report that Ms. Broderick and her team indicated that the report, the policy background was solid, but could be enhanced, and specifically enhanced around the processes we use to support people through making a complaint and further, and we've been working on that for a little while.
Look, I don't want to. If I engage in the process of cutting you off, and I'm not trying to be rude, but I just want to get surgically through what I've got to get through here because it's important we tease out the detail. So, in terms of being made publicly available, is there an intention to make the response publicly available?
Absolutely.
And will the Premier be making a separate and fulsome response to your knowledge?
The Premier has indicated in a letter to PEG or to, I should say, the Speaker and myself, that as leader of the New South Wales Government, his intention is to convene a group of cross-party leaders to assist the New South Wales Parliament, PEG and the Parliamentary Advisory Group implement a non-partisan response to the recommendations of the report. So we'll be engaging in that process, and obviously we'll be working through that once we've had an opportunity to work through the implementation phase and work through a work plan and indeed respond to those recommendations in the quickest possible way we can.
That meeting's on Thursday afternoon.
Well, I haven't received an actual date for it myself. I haven't sort of seen that.
The rest of us have. It's at 3 o'clock on Thursday, 2 days from now.
So there's no, at this stage, there's no intention, as far as we know, for the Premier to make a discrete standalone response. It'll be the formation of this cross. Yeah, okay.
That's my understanding.
Can I ask, in terms of...
Can I just clarify on that? So is it the case that the parliamentary officers haven't been advised of the meeting of the Premier's
The
convening?
officers have been overseas, I think.
They may have.
He's on the mail out.
I've literally just arrived back in the country.
I just wanted to clarify whether there'd been a decision by the Premier not to include...
No, it's very clear the Premier is in
No, on the email that was sent to my
engaged.
office, included the President and the Speaker at 3 o'clock this Thursday.
What about financial resources being made available to implement the recommendations. Has Premier and Treasury given you an indication of that would be forthcoming?
We have had some indication that would be forthcoming. So in terms of the scope of that will be obviously determined once we're able to respond to the recommendations specifically.
Okay. The report establishes that there are several urgent workplace health and safety issues within the parliamentary precinct that require some immediate work. Have you invited Safe Work New South Wales to assist with the Parliament's response to the issues in the report and ensure everyone is in compliance with their WHS obligations as employers?
I don't believe we've responded to, or asked WorkSafe. I mean, at this point in time, we've got the report. We're reviewing it. We're looking at each of the areas in terms of the recommendations. In terms of WorkSafe New South Wales, it's something that we haven't invited them into the workplace. Obviously, we'll be making an assessment of the report and dealing with each of the recommendations and working out a way forward in consultation with the various stakeholder groups.
The reason I asked the question, President, is that that specifically in respect of the urgent WHS issues that came out of the report. So do you know if Safe Work has expressed an interest in the findings?
I'm not aware, but I might ask Mr Webb too.
We haven't been contacted by Safe Work. They haven't expressed any direct interest to us as yet. Part of the review that we're doing to go through the recommendations is to work out who we need to engage with and who we need to consult with for each of the recommendations. I should also mention that some of the recommendations, of course, are not directed at the Parliament's administration. They're directed at political parties and the like as well. So we're also just trying to work through and make sure that we're focused on the things that impact the Parliament's administration. But we will be, there is a real commitment to bring in experts where required. We, for instance, brought in specialised support services based on the findings of the report to focus on particular groups that seem to be particularly affected by it. So I don't have any objection to bringing in Safe Work to look at specific issues. We just haven't got to the point where we're ready to make that call.
Okay. In terms of the Parliamentary Complaints Officer role, where are we up to in terms of that role being made available for staff to make complaints? It's been the subject of a number of media reports, and I understand the Premier and the Leader of the Opposition are on a unity ticket about bringing this forward. Can you throw some light on that?
Yes, I can. Rose Webb signed a contract last Friday, and in that regard, the first step in relation to that is obviously to develop some protocols in relation to the investigation work, and indeed some MOUs or memorandums of understanding with ICAC as well as the Anti-Discrimination Board, which there are cross overlaps in terms of the areas that Ms Webb will be investigating, and obviously in that regard I'm talking about sexual misconduct and the like, which the Anti-Discrimination Board has jurisdiction. So there are a range of those what I call preliminary issues that need to be sorted through, and those protocols will be very important to governing the work of the Independent Complaints Officer. And I think in that regard there'll be reference to some of the work that's been done in other jurisdictions, particularly the ACT, which has gone through these similar processes more recently, but that process will be the first major task of Ms Webb, and in that regard I might just ask Mr Webb to perhaps provide further comments, or David.
Mr Buttigieg, the clerks were, myself and in my absence, the Deputy Clerk of the LC, were involved in finalising Ms Webb's contract and ensuring that was in an appropriate form for her to sign last Friday, and so I'm delighted that to confirm that she is now engaged and she's ready to commence that role. She will be developing a communications plan in conjunction with staff of the Parliament, but really as she's an independent officer appointed according to a resolution of both houses and the appointment by the presiding officers, those communications will really be her responsibility to communicate in the way she sees fit and to make the whole of the parliamentary community aware of her role and the steps by which people can make complaints. So we expect that to be rolling out in the next couple of weeks.
Okay. And in terms of the resourcing for that, has it been adequately resourced already, or is that still a work in process?
Ms Webb will be receiving, effectively she'll be on a retainer, and there is an amount that she will receive on an annual basis. If the workload is more than anticipated, then there are arrangements by which she can be paid an additional daily rate, but we're not anticipating that to be required at this stage. We're thoroughly committed to this and to making it work. I've personally got a lot invested in ensuring this works. I've been calling for such a position to be created for 9 years, so I'm absolutely delighted that it's got across the line, and I know the LC Privileges Committee for all of that time, and in fact before that time, has been calling for it to work as well. So we will ensure that she has all the resources that she needs to perform the function effectively.
Are there plans to roll out training for the staff in terms of the mechanisms for them to go to her and report?
Again, that will be part of that communications plan that Ms Webb rolls out, and will be, it's really, in a sense, up to her how she wants that to work, but we will work hand in glove with her to make sure she has all the support she needs to ensure the staff are aware, all staff, both parliamentary staff and members' staff, are aware of the pathways to report, etc.
So if I'm a person looking at all this thinking, when can I actually go to her? When do you think practically that would be able to happen?
Well, she's on board. Her jurisdiction has commenced, so she can receive a complaint now. But in terms of the publicity around how those mechanisms will work, that's really in her hands. We expect that to roll out in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you. Given the role of the Parliamentary Advisory Group, which provides a representative cross-party body that has been established for over years. So this is the group, I think, which has got both MPs and staff on it. Why was there a separate cross-party group exclusively of MPs established to discuss the implementation of the report's recommendations? Because you got these, I suppose there's this view that, well...
Are you talking about the Premier's group?
Well, there's a Parliamentary Advisory Group, which is a cross-party body.
There's a Premier's leadership group, isn't it?
Yeah. So look, the Premier's leadership group is a very recent innovation, and in that regard, we'll see how things go on Thursday. Obviously, this is a responsibility of the Parliamentary Executive Group to respond to a report that was commissioned by the Parliamentary Executive Group. We'll be doing that in consultation with the Leaders Group, as we'll refer to them in this conversation. And obviously the Parliamentary Advisory Group is key and has been key for well over a year now. It was established in early 2021. And as a response to those early discussions, the Broderick Review was commissioned. So in that regard, the Parliamentary Advisory Group is the key consultative mechanism that Parliament has, which is a broadly, as you said, representative group across all key
But that
profiles
Premier's
in the
group,
Parliament.
which the Chair touched on, just so I get this right, that's exclusively MPs, isn't it? So there would be, and their role is to discuss the implementation of the report recommendations?
Yes, the Premier has, if you like, written to us in that regard.
Is that letter in the public domains?
That letter, I'm not sure whether it's been publicly released or not. I received it whilst I was away.
I don't think it's been publicly released. It was written, I know I got mine, it was written to the leaders of the various parties in the Parliament.
Yeah, so I imagine
Labor Party
it's available to each, and it refers...
Ms Menz has got a copy.
Yeah.
Have you, I mean, I suppose the
was whether
question...
it's in the public domain, that's a separate
Well, you can put it in the public domain if you want to. You can take mine.
It's it's pretty straightforward. I don't think there's any secret about
Invitation
it. The Premier simply reached out in response to the report and made it very clear that it's his highest priority and intention to convene a group of cross-party leaders to assist the Parliament and the Parliamentary Advisory Group to implement the Broderick Review recommendations.
I suppose if you're a staff person looking at this, and there's one of the key things to come out of the report was the asymmetry of power and the power dynamic, you think, great, so there's a separate group of MPs who are going to discuss how to implement all this, and we're shut out. I mean, to put
No, that's not the case at all. It is not the case at all. It is simply a part of the key stakeholders in this Parliament. There is a whole range of key stakeholders. The reality is this implementation plan requires consultation with party leadership, political parties. It requires consultation with staff of all the different departments and MPs and ministerial staff. It's a very, very complex work environment, and you can rest assured that the Parliamentary Executive Group will be consulting with all those stakeholders and ensuring that the implementation and of the recommendations is done in a most consultative way, not with any preference to one group or another, but in a very considered and inclusive way.
Let's jump in. I just wanted to ask about, obviously, one element of the Broderick report was these allegations of sexual assault, which are criminal matters. I wanted to know what's going to be the approach of the Parliament to that aspect of the alleged behaviour that's come out of, that has been exposed by the Broderick report.
The Broderick report found through the process of the personal interviews as well as the survey work that there were 5 cases of sexual assault or attempted sexual assault, 3 men and 2 women. Now, obviously, referrals were given to those people to ensure they understood what they could do if they wished to, and that's a matter for each of those individuals involved. And obviously that information was not provided in any sort of particularity to any member. It was done on a completely confidential and private basis, which is obviously the appropriate response in that regard. So that will be a case, as it always is, for those individuals concerned to make a referral, should they wish, to the New South Wales Police Force, if they wish to take...
That hasn't been done already.
The information in relation to that has been provided. That's up to the individuals concerned as to whether they wish to take that complaint forward. In terms of that, I think the clerk wishes to...
If I can just refer you to page 4 of the Broderick report as published. The final paragraph on that page, if I can read it, it's only 3 sentences. The review did not extend to investigating or making any findings about any individual incident or allegation or about any individuals. All individuals who disclosed an experience of harmful behaviour were provided with appropriate referrals, as was any individual who was seeking an investigation of their current or past experience. Where ongoing risk or harm was identified, the review team notified the relevant authorities.
We're going to crossbench now. Mr. Latham.
Thank you, Chair. We're just following up on that matter. Are we to believe that the 5 individuals that you're referring to, who've made anonymous allegations of sexual assault, haven't referred this to the police already?
I don't know.
What do you mean you don't know?
This is something that's not within my purview of my knowledge.
It could be 5 people who work in politics, the lawmaking parliament concerning the criminal laws of New South Wales, and you don't know whether they've taken these matters to the police.
This is a report that was...
How substantial can the matters be if they haven't been referred to the police?
Well, I don't have the answer to that information.
No. Are you aware of Section 316 of the Crimes Act, where concealing serious indictable offences is against the law of New South Wales? Has Broderick or any of your executive referred these matters onto the police, knowing the contents of 316?
This information was brought up in the context of the Broderick Review on a non-particularised basis, and as referred to by the clerk just a moment ago, depending on the nature of what was occurred, that the referrals were made appropriately with the information provided to those people to ensure that they were able to move forward on that pathway if they chose.
But the information was disclosed to Broderick, and I assume now the Parliamentary Executive. Have you complied with the provisions of 316 of the Crimes Act, which is an authority, whether you like it or not, an authority greater than you or Broderick or anyone else in this room?
As it's stated in the Broderick report, the relevant information was provided to the relevant authorities.
And you've got no idea whether they've gone to the police. So how seriously can we take any of these matters?
I think you can take them very seriously in the context in which the report was conducted.
And how many of these matters have been proven that are listed in the report?
What you're driving at in terms
Well,
of
the report is what in politics you'd refer to as one long shit sheet of anonymous allegations against unknown individuals, a couple of whom have been the subject of leaking to the media, Mihalik and Secord, and I suppose Leong, to say that they're guilty of certain offences. I'm asking how many of these matters listed in the report have been proven? The answer is zero, isn't it?
The report is done in relation to both quantitative and qualitative analysis. So we're talking, as you know, a survey which was responded to by 447 people, representing 27.7% of the workforce here in Parliament and in parliamentary offices. The reality is that was done in a very robust fashion through a survey which provided quantitative material, and that material has been arraigned in the context of the report in a very detailed way over the course of the actual...
Why would you take seriously anything in politics that hasn't even been investigated, let alone proven?
This is a robust and detailed...
What's robust about anonymous allegations against unnamed parties in politics that can then be leaked to the media to rub people out at pre-selection time? What's robust about that? Isn't that just the worst element of party politics that your executive and the Broderick process has actually fostered? You've created this star chamber environment, and already 3 MPs have suffered from it without a single thing proven against them, not a single thing even investigated about them in this report.
This is a report that's been developed on the basis of individual one-on-one interviews. They are confidential. It is private to protect those who are providing that information. The actual full evaluation of the survey is done on a confidential basis in order to ensure that information can be brought forward, and the confidence of all those people who have been interviewed and all those people who have given responses to the surveys is important in the context of being able to assimilate that information. In terms of the actual information itself and the quality of that, that's been independently assessed and indeed is as robust as anything in this field. The reality is it's not a court of law. It's not a laid out situation in the time that in the way that you're putting to me, but it's a very clear and very detailed report based on reliable data.
Allegations against members of Parliament elected here to serve the people of New South Wales, shouldn't they at least be investigated and then proven before they're published, diminishing the reputation of this place?
Well, as was very clearly mentioned earlier, there are a whole range of people who have been affected who have been given referral information to, if they wish to step forward, be it in relation to bullying or sexual harassment or whatever conduct they've experienced. And I don't think you can sit and just quietly just wave them away on the basis that there hasn't been any proof in a court of law.
No, any proof in this process. I'm not talking about a court of law. I'm waving away an anonymous shit sheet, as anyone with any intelligence in politics would.
I think that's a pretty offensive way of responding to a report that has been done.
We'll go talk to Mihalik and Secord and Leong. You mentioned earlier on, President, that these matters were confidential. How have they ended up in the media for those 3 MPs when there wasn't anything proven or even investigated against them?
Well, I'm not aware of all the details in that regard, and I think in the respect of what was done in the media...
Can anyone answer, Webb or Blunt, as to how what was supposed to be a confidential process has ended up in the media, ending the career of at least one MP who had no complaints against him, seconded from his own staff.
The whole basis of this was meant to be...
No. Can I get an answer to that? How what was supposed to be a confidential process has ended up in the media, in the case of Rod Secord ending his career, in the case of Mihalik immersed in a Labor Party pre-selection battle over the seat of Bankstown, and in the case of Leong, an allegation that she's a bully.
Well, if I can just say that the idea that people have used confidential report in that way, I think is something that was not intended. Now, as to how that reached the media and people identified whichever of the members that you mentioned, I'm not sure how that happened. I'm not sure.
Well, what are you going to do to stop it in the future? Because it's an abusive process. It's a denial of procedural fairness. I mean, our chamber has a resolution of procedural fairness. Where's the procedural fairness here for Mihalik, Secord and Leong, who've had anonymous allegations made against them, not investigated, not proven, leaked to the media for political purposes, and their reputation is traduced in the public arena? Where's their procedural fairness?
Look, the reality is this report was done on a confidential basis. If people want to use a report like this to attack people, I think that's very unfortunate.
What are you going to do to stop it in the future? Because I'm assuming the so-called complaints officer will operate exactly the same way and be subject to exactly the same sort of political abuse.
That's certainly not what is envisaged. The complaints officer...
What are you doing to stop it?
Well, that's why we're working through protocols in relation to how investigations...
We're told she started. Ms Webb has started. What's being done to stop the abuse of her processes that occurred out of the Broderick report?
Well,
in the case of 3 MPs, not any people sitting up there who've had to cop this media firestorm against them, but 3 MPs who've not had a single thing proven against them. That's a disgrace.
Well, the reality is if people want to use whatever process to besmirch people, there are always people that will take whatever course of action they deem appropriate. I'm not responsible for that.
So it's a star chamber. You're acknowledging it's a star chamber, and that's not so bad.
I think everyone...
And how are we going to know that this isn't going to happen like this in the future? That this process is going to be safeguarded and people won't be abusing? I mean, the very nature of this place is that people take every advantage against one another as they possibly can, whether it's internally within parties or between parties. Isn't this whole process open to abuse in this way?
Well, the process in relation to the independent complaints officer is being set up at this stage, and whilst Ms Webb has been brought on board, that process will be subject to confidential provisions and obviously ensuring that people have complete confidence to report matters that are affecting them in their workplace. At the same time, protocols in relation to how investigations will be conducted to ensure that all those elements are pursued in the most private and confidential manner.
President, you know that to be untrue. President, you know that to be untrue because at page 84 of her report, Broderick has recommended eliminating non-disclosure agreements. How can it stay confidential with the complaints officer if you're accepting the Broderick recommendations to eliminate all non-disclosure agreements? What you've just told us is untrue.
Page 84 of the report, it's a bibliography. Sorry, Mr. Clark.
Mr. Latham, can I just add a further response to Mr. Borzak's initial question, Mr. Chair, if I can? The independent complaints officer has...
Sorry, page 82. Page 82 of the report recommends eliminating non-disclosure agreements.
Mr. Clark would respond on that.
The independent complaints officer has been established by resolution of both houses after very careful review by both privileges committees. Clause 5C of the resolution of the Legislative Council provides that members of the parliamentary community who are not members of the Parliament and who make complaints shall be required to maintain confidentiality concerning complaints and investigations. Others involved in any complaints investigations, for example witnesses, shall be required to maintain confidentiality concerning complaints and investigations. There are further, it goes on to further provisions in relation to...
You're rejecting the Broderick recommendation to eliminate non-disclosure agreements?
I think that question was directed to the
There's a direct contradiction here.
President.
You can't say anything's confidential if Broderick is recommending that the Parliament doesn't use any non-disclosure agreements. You see the direct contradiction?
I don't accept that there's a contradiction, because I think the recommendation about non-disclosure agreements is aimed in a different direction. But if I can just finish in relation to this issue of confidentiality and the independent complaints officer. The other thing to which I draw members' attention, and I think this should give everyone in the parliamentary community great comfort, is that the privileges committees of both houses are required to review the independent complaints officer system within 12 months of its establishment. So that's the safeguard for everyone in this community.
So leading into the next election, which is over the next 6 months, any number of MPs can be wiped out on the Secord, Mahay, Leong precedent. Or if you make a complaint anonymously, then you leak it to the media. You didn't have to prove anything. There was no non-disclosure agreement, and these MPs suffer. You know, we're going into an election environment where more of these things are going to happen in this Star Chamber arrangement. It's inevitable, isn't it?
Chair, can I have my time now? Okay.
Yeah, we're in your time now.
Thank you. I thought we were. Thank you.
I'll take that as a comment.
You'll take that as a reality that you should be ashamed of.
I only have really one point on the Broderick review, and given its, the significant focus on protection of people in our parliamentary community, particularly staff, who are in the weaker, more vulnerable position than in the power balance than their employer MPs. One of the recommendations goes to reviewing the MOPS Act, or the Member of Parliament Staff Act, and updating relevant written employment agreements. Have we given thought at this point to, and I absolutely recognise we're still in the preliminary early phases of response and that it's an enormous report, have we given thought to what the sort of, in terms of legislative review, and how that would be undertaken, given this really is just such an apolitical, it requires such an apolitical response? Have we given thought to how we would do that? And my inquiry comes mainly through the recognition that the staff in this place are really structurally disadvantaged under the current manner and form that the MOPS Act provides for.
In terms of the Broderick recommendations in relation to the MOPS Act, look, obviously we're going to examine them in detail, but they're pretty clearly looking at that power imbalance and certainly explicit protections for staff that are under the MOPS Act is a consideration, as is, I think, a practical one in the suggestion that there be provisions created to stop MPs from terminating an employee whilst an investigation of a complaint is underway. So there are some practical things that we need to work through, an appropriate dispute resolution mechanism. So we're obviously taking on board what Elizabeth Broderick has said in that regard, and as part of the implementation phase, we're looking at that. There's also a recommendation that we should commission an independent expert review of the MOPS Act itself to look at these things. So obviously that's something we're looking at, and we'll be able to give a response on that front fairly shortly. But I'll ask perhaps Mr. Webb to add anything you might wish to in that regard as well.
Yes, so absolutely everything the President's just said. We are looking at how to balance achieving some of the outcomes that Broderick is talking about with ensuring that the system is workable down the track. So, for instance, if a relationship of trust breaks down between a member and their staff, regardless of the cause of it, forcing them to continue to work together is probably not an outcome that can work out. So what is the right balance? How do we make sure we balance all of those issues moving through? You might recall, actually you weren't at previous budget estimates, but for others that were, we had also in parallel to Broderick, former President Ajaka had made a commitment in this forum that we would do a review of the members of Parliament staff conditions of employment as well. So that has been happening this year. We paused it to wait for the Broderick review to come out to make sure that Kelly Edwards, who's undertaking that review, could take into account any feedback that the Broderick review did. She's obviously recommenced her work once the Broderick review came out. So it's probably a combination of three things that we're looking at: the provisions of the Act itself, the annual presiding officer's determination, which outlines conditions of employment for staff, and what the Parliamentary Remuneration Tribunal says about the employment of staff as well. So those three sort of employment instruments, if you like, are under consideration at the moment. What I want to do is make sure that we get the positive outcomes that Ms. Broderick has put forward, but without creating an unworkable situation where things really break down. So that it is a big piece of work that we're undertaking.
So just in terms of timing around that, though, I think that's also a significant factor because, I think that is, obviously it's all very important, but there's so many current members of staff, and of course this report now has brought it all to the surface. So in terms of timing around improving their position, what are we looking at?
Well, Kelly Edwards, who's been doing the conditions review, will be due to finish fairly soon. As I said, we were just waiting for the Broderick review. So she undertook consultation with staff, talked with a huge number of people. Unions gave feedback as well. Talked with some members about that staffing relationship as well. So she's done all of that legwork. It was really just waiting for whether something came out of Broderick that she should take into account. So that's due to be completed soon. I can't give you an exact date here today, but soon. We'll then look at implementation of that in context of the Broderick Review's implementation as well to make sure there's no crossover. There's the intent is to move quickly through to implementation, to make adjustments to the conditions of employment determination, to make submissions to the PRT if that's what's required. One of the issues, again, some that have been in this forum will know that was put forward was that the salary of people that work in members' staff positions hadn't been reviewed. It's gone up, obviously, with the wages policy, but it hasn't. The base level of salary hasn't been reviewed in recorded memory. We don't have any records of a review ever being undertaken. So this is also reviewing the salary of people that are in those positions as well. So we've had position descriptions, again, which we've done extensive consultation on, written up. We're having a completely independent review of those position descriptions by Mercer, who do all of the position description to salary conversions across the public sector. So it's a completely independent.
And when is that due back?
Soon. I can't give you an exact date, but soon.
All right, thank you. So just moving on from the Broderick review, we recently were looking at having an intern come into our office and the possibility of that person being in a wheelchair. And when I looked at what the safety requirements, etc., if there was a fire in the building or an emergency, the requirement would be to leave that person in the wheelchair because there's no way for them to leave like everybody else.
Sorry, you mean leave them behind?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Leave
not
Leave them behind to burn?
To wait
Pick them up and carry them
for
to safety?
to wait for. I literally, fell off my chair, obviously. And the reason is, my understanding is the reason is our fire stairs and escape is not fit for that purpose. And I just was curious about, are we alert to that issue? Is that something we're looking at? Is that something we can address?
Yes, so you're quite right. The protocol at the moment for those parts of the building where there isn't accessible, like you can't use the lifts essentially in a fire. So for those situations, the fire stairs are rated to withstand fire as per the code. The protocol at the moment is to move the person in the wheelchair into the fire stair space so that they've got that level of protection, and for the firefighters to come up and carry the person down. That is the protocol at the moment for those parts of the building that aren't accessible. I don't have don't have unpowered accessible access out of the building. We are looking at accessibility all the way through. It is an issue that we are very alive to. You would have seen that we've been looking at making accessible adjustments wherever we can. Difficult in a heritage building and difficult in a building built in the 1970s, to be perfectly honest, before there were building codes and accessible access codes. But that is something that we're looking at. Some of our proposals for the long term, which would involve, for instance, if members of the Legislative Council were all to get 2 staff like the crossbench currently has, we don't have enough room for that to put all those staff in on level 11. So we are starting to turn our minds to what the long-term capacity issues are around the building, and issues like this around accessible access and safety are at the top of the list of things that we're looking at as a part of that. But it is difficult. I don't want to pretend that it isn't an issue. It is difficult in the building that we're in at the moment. There's no doubt about it.
So it's not, sorry, just to follow, so we can't just look at, sorry, not just, it's not possible to put a chairlift on the current fire stairs.
The two issues with that, the first is that if it's powered, then you can't use it in a fire anyway. So those kind of stair lift things, because of the nature of them, they're powered. Otherwise, if they're not powered, you're going to have to move the person by hand in the first place. So they're not usable in an emergency situation. And also, the fire stairs have to be a certain width and so everyone can get out. You've got large numbers of people exiting the building at the same time. You put a chairlift in there, A, it can't be used in a fire, and B, it blocks access for everybody leaving. So it is problematic. I should say we're not the only. This is a problem that all high-rise buildings have around the place. We're not special in that sense. But I did want to emphasise just to pick up Mr. Borzak's comment before, it's not leaving people to burn. It's moving people to the safest possible place, and then having the experts come up and get them out of the building as quickly as possible.
All on me and Farlow will carry him out.
Thank you.
It
Thank
won't be
you.
like Costanza in the Seinfeld.
Thank you.
I would. I applaud the heroism of both of you in
I'm
advance.
volunteering, even though they're agreeing. I'm volunteering. to
Very,
carry
very,
him out.
very nice of you. It's very ecumenical. You also nominated her for deputy chair this morning. So
I did, yeah.
the One Nation Greens
She's
Alliance.
a lot better than Shoebridge.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Nice to see you. Welcome back. I think that we've ventilated pretty much all of my questions on the Broderick review. However, I'd just like to ask one to cover it off, and then I'll move on to another series of questions. But just with respect to the independence complaints handling process, what do you envisage being effectively the process, how it's managed, how it's resourced, and also the consequences in terms of any findings upheld and how they will be enacted?
All those sort of issues before Ms. Rose-Webb, in terms of working through some of the protocols that I mentioned earlier. So they'll be all made public. Obviously, it depends on the nature of the complaint and just where it falls on the wide sort of spectrum. So obviously, if it was a complaint that dealt with an entitlement issue, that may be something much more straightforward. If it's something that deals with sexual harassment or into the province, if you like, of sexual assault or attempted sexual assault, that will depend on the necessary authorities that will need to be referred to. So there's a range of protocols that Ms. Webb's working through, not only with ICAC, for example, on the entitlement sort of issues, and how that will work and how that overlaps with ICAC's jurisdiction, but also in relation to the Anti-Discrimination Board in relation to sexual assault issues, obviously issues of sexual harassment, and indeed referral to police appropriately as well. So those things require a very detailed protocol response, which Ms. Webb in the first instance is working through, obviously very made public and communicated widely to everybody in the parliamentary precinct, so that people are very, very clear about how each of these complaints, depending which category they fall in, will be dealt with, and ensure that there is very much an accountability regime in that regard. And as to disclosure, that will depend on the nature of the actual complaint. So I think that will become fairly self-evident once those protocols have been publicly released. But I
And
noticed
so
that
what's
Clark
the,
might like to add a bit more detail on that.
And I might just ask before the clerk answers as well, what's the timeline that you're envisioning at the moment for this to be rolled out, made public and in place?
I think that's in the next few weeks, but David, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, over the next couple of weeks, we expect that Ms. Webb, in conjunction with our people, will be communicating to the entire parliamentary community about those systems and complaints handling systems. In terms of your earlier question, though, Mr. Farlow, if I can just emphasise 3 key words in relation to the Independent Complaints Officer. Firstly, confidentiality. I referred to some of the provisions of Clause 5C of the resolution, and they're repeated throughout. The emphasis is on handling complaints confidentially. Secondly, timeliness. That sits behind the resolution of the 2 houses, and the expectations of the Privileges Committees is that the Independent Complaints Officer will resolve complaints as expeditiously as possible, so things aren't left hanging around, either for the complainant or the person complained about. And thirdly, the third word is rectification. The emphasis here is on the matters that are complained about, if they do have substance, and if the Independent Complaints Officer upholds the complaint, is to ensure that there is early and immediate rectification, whether that's repayment of a misused allowance, whether it's updating of pecuniary interest disclosure return, or indeed whether it's taking some action to rectify a matter together with the complainant in relation to inappropriate behaviour.
Thank you very much. And I'll now turn to the Mookie wing and Standing Order 52s. Just interested, Mr. President, and maybe through you to the clerk, what's the total number of order for papers that have been passed this year and the total since 2019?
I'll refer that to the clerk. I think he's got those figures at his fingertips.
Not enough.
We'll no doubt have them at his
They
fingertips.
hate this. God, they hate this.
Wasn't your attitude when you came in?
Should be more of it.
Accountability.
I didn't know enough about this government. It's interesting.
Open governments, transparency.
If you just publish them electronically, there won't be an issue.
Mr. Farlow, unfortunately, I am going to have to rummage through my weighty folder here to find the precise number for you, which I will, I promise, during the course
If you want
of
to
this
come back
hearing.
after the break, that's fine.
Yes, I can come back to you after the break. Unfortunately, I don't have that number at my fingertips, and even if I did, it would probably be out of date by the time I come back after. There are so many.
You're misleading the city. We're not sitting.
Well, can I ask you another question along this line? What is the total cost of storage for all the boxes that sit within the Mookie wing in your office? And in other assorted locations?
Shots on democracy.
The cost is minimal in terms of dollar figures. The only real cost is on the time that members are required to take to delve through those boxes, and a number of members sitting around the table here are frequent visitors to the so-called Mookie wing. Obviously, the number of Standing Order 52 orders for papers has imposed significant resource implications on the public service. We're conscious of that every time we assist a member with the drafting of an order to try and assist to ensure that they are focused and that they balance capturing everything the members wanting to obtain with the degree of knowledge as to where that document sits, and ensuring that it's broad enough to not miss the document, but not so broad to impose unreasonable burdens. In terms of storage, I know that you, together with others, have visited the Mookie wing recently, and that you'd be aware of how many boxes there are in there. We also, about every 3 months, we send a consignment off to state archives. We can get any of those documents back within 24 hours notice. So I do in fact have those statistics here now. So in 2019 there were 52 orders for papers, 2020 there were 116 orders for papers, 2021 there were 172, and between the 1st of January and the 30th of June 2022 there were 63 orders for papers. 57th Parliament so far, 403. So, yes, it is more than any other parliamentary term.
Government.
But I guess the question is, yes, there are financial implications and there are administrative burdens placed on the public sector and also the Department of the Legislative Council. But I guess the question is, what price accountability and democracy?
Cost when we win government.
And I'm sure your consciousness will be pricked at that time. You mentioned the constraints in terms of storage and in the Mookie wing. Have you investigated any other options for storage space within the Parliament for Standing Order 52s and the boxes?
At times we do repurpose other rooms within the Department of the Legislative Council, sort of share of the corporate accommodation space, and everyone's very cooperative with that because everyone understands how important this is and how fundamental it is to the operations of the Legislative Council. But it is I do just want to take the opportunity to pay tribute to the staff in the procedure team, not only those who are involved in working with each of you in relation to the drafting of orders for papers, but the staff who deal with the, I guess, the process of dealing with such significant volumes of documentation, and they keep on top of them absolutely brilliantly.
And on average, how much staff time is dedicated to the processing of those Standing Order 52s?
I don't think I could give you a percentage figure off the top of my head, but it is a fundamentally important part of the work of the Legislative Council, and therefore it's, I regard it as one of the most important things that I'm charged with providing administrative support to all of you in relation to.
Do you have any average figures on the average number of members who view documents on Standing Order 52s?
Look, I'd have to take that question on notice. But what I would indicate, obviously, members who inspect privileged documents, sign a register. Each of you who have been to view those privileged documents would have a pretty fair idea how many of your colleagues are looking at things in terms of public documents. We do keep a record for administrative purposes, but we don't publish that. All I would say is that
It has a register. You've got to sign for non-privilege, is it?
yes, there is a form that's completed by everyone who comes to inspect those documents, whether it's members, staff, members of the press, or members of the public who make appointments.
Okay. Well, if when taking it on notice, if you'd be able to provide the amount on average that view documents from an SO52, how many documents on average are photocopied per SO52, if you've got that information, and also how many members on average view privileged documents from an SO?
I'm not sure that I would be able to provide you with anything in relation to the average number of documents that are photocopied. As a number, at least one member who's sitting at the table knows, we've put in place provisions during the course of this Parliament whereby documents that are public, those that aren't subject to a claim of privilege, can be scanned, and in many cases of returns, those documents are being scanned in their entirety, I think. I'm looking for yes, I'm getting some nods. So those documents are scanned in their entirety. So in terms of who then accesses those, that's out of our control. It's beyond the number of people who actually come in person to the office to inspect them physically.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Now turning to a different line of questioning. Just with respect to committees, we of course are meeting here today in 8:14, 8:15. Just with the amount of committees, and I noticed that we are having trouble in terms of LA committees and LC committees meeting on the same day. I think one day recently where we were looking for a public accountability committee, and there might have been 5 committee meetings taking place at the same time. Has there been any investigation of additional committee space within the Parliament to cater for all the committees that are meeting?
Yes, indeed. We've had obviously some capital works ongoing in a number of those committee rooms over the course of a number of months. Obviously, works in relation to audiovisual and other sort of upgrades for IT and the like. But you know, it's an ongoing issue. I might ask Mr. Webb to comment on that specifically, because it's certainly something that we're cognizant of, and indeed as we move further down towards some of the redevelopment works, it's something that we're looking for opportunities in the future. And I might just ask Mr. Webb to respond on that specifically.
Absolutely. Yes, you'll be familiar with some of the work we've been doing. We do try to work around the committee schedule as much as possible. That does sometimes mean that if I take the Macquarie Room as an example, we had to split the works into 2 sections, one that we could do over Christmas and then one that we could do over the winter recess, to try and minimise the impact on committees. Not perfect, of course, because we need them for longer periods of time. Most recently, we've been working to try and eliminate the noises, the sources of noise in the Preston Stanley room, so that it can be used as a committee room. You might recall there were 2 sources of noise that were causing the Preston Stanley room to be not suitable for committee hearings. One was the air conditioning system was just too loud. The second was that it is just above the trash room on level 6, and there are chillers down there that keep the trash cool. I would suggest to you that you really want those chillers to be keeping the trash cool, otherwise there would be a completely different set of problems across the area. But one of those chillers is quite loud, and so we're looking at insulating it to eliminate that as a source of noise. Then once we've done that, which will be done in the next hopefully in the next few weeks, depending on how that works goes, the Preston Stanley room will become suitable to be a committee room. It has basic audio-visual. Over Christmas, we'll be installing the new audio-visual equipment in there as well. But in the meantime, it will be able to use similarly to here with a portable. This is the setup that we used when the Regional Health Committee went around, and we were the first Parliament in Australia to live broadcast regional committees by basically using this portable equipment. So we'll be able to use that in Preston Stanley between now and the end of the year, and then over Christmas we'll have the new audio-visual equipment installed in there as well. In terms of the longer term, dedicated committee space is one of our key capacity issues that we're looking at, not just in terms of the number of rooms, but if you go to a Parliament that has built a committee space from scratch as opposed to just repurposing rooms, they usually have things like a green room for witnesses to wait in, separate entrances and exits so that you don't have groups of witnesses crossing over each other as they come in and out. Obviously, different jurisdictions have different requirements around language. If you go to the Canadian parliaments, they have translation booths and all the rest. That's not relevant for us. So in terms of the capacity of the Parliament in the long term, we're not only looking for additional committee space, but also looking to see where we might be able to build dedicated committee space that has been designed to function for committees. Because up until now, as you know, the Macquarie Room was the former staff canteen, the Jubilee Room was the former library, the Preston Stanley Room was the members' bar. These are just retrofitted spaces that we've just jammed committee equipment into. New South Wales Parliament has never had dedicated built committee space, and given the volume of activity, which I'm imagining will not decrease anytime soon, we do feel that the long-term plans for the Parliament should take into account having more and dedicated committee space.
Thank you very much. And with respect to that, in terms of the transition of the Preston Stanley Room, are you looking at upgrading this as well into having a permanent audio-visual?
We're looking at a lot of different options at the moment. Level 8, there'll be. You'll have noticed over the last few years we've been replacing all the ceiling, doing all the air conditioning replacement and cabling replacement and ceiling tiles and the like. We've left the corporate accommodation here on level 8 till last. Make sure members of areas were taken care of first, and then moving out through the rest of the building. We are going through and looking at this whole level 8 and how we use level 8 as a part of that at the moment. So we're in a planning phase for that right now. We hadn't intended, I would say originally we hadn't intended on doing that here. We thought the President's Standing Room would actually remove the need for this room to be used. But the points you've made about the volume of committee activity and the crossover between the LA and the LC are points well made, and that's something that we're considering right now.
Thank you very much. And Mr. President, and to the clerk as well, in terms of committee inquiries, what's the average cost to the Parliament of a committee inquiry? I know that they all vary quite
Yeah, will
significantly.
vary quite significantly. But do you have any sort of average costs, David, perhaps? Or?
That's a very difficult question to answer because every committee inquiry is completely different. An inquiry reviewing the provisions of a bill is unlikely to have any cost in terms of committee travel and all of that sort of thing. And I guess the model that we have for staffing and supporting committees is such that each staff member is supporting multiple committee inquiries at any time. So it's very difficult to apportion costs to individual inquiries. But again, I'm happy to take it on notice and to see if I can come back to you with something sensible, but it would be difficult to do so, I think.
And to that point of multiple committee inquiries being supported by each staff member, I know for a period we did have some significant concern in terms of the staffing constraints when it came to the committee secretariat. Has that concern been alleviated somewhat recently, or is that still a concern, and have there been additional staff that have been required to be put on in the committee secretariat?
I'm just nervously looking over my shoulder to see if the Clerk Assistant Committees is here to before the Acting Clerk Assistant Committees is here, and I'm not getting an evil look, but I will say that look, on behalf of the department and the Legislative Council, I think I can say that we are grateful to the support that New South Wales Treasury has provided over a number of occasions during the course of this parliamentary term. On 4 separate occasions, parameter and technical adjustment bids have been positively dealt with by Treasury, and we've incrementally received additional funding to the point that the committee office is now roughly double the size of what it was 4 years ago, although the amount of work has tripled rather than doubled by all of you making use of the committees. It's a fine line. We have some benchmarks in terms of roughly 2 inquiries per grade 9-10 principal council officer, and we're frequently just sort of sailing either just above or on that benchmark. So I think I think we're coping but it's really up to your judgment as to whether you're continuing to receive the high standards of support that you've always received from the committee office. From the feedback I get from you, I think the answer is very much yes, that you are receiving that high quality service.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to tidy up one more question before I hand over to my colleague. Mr. Webb, the cleaning staff of Parliament don't have access to computers, so they obviously can't participate in staff surveys. What will the Parliament do about identifying that issue?
Yeah, they don't have individual computers assigned to them, although we do give them access to computers. But where we are undertaking any form of survey, whether it be a staff survey or our participation in say something like the People Matters employee survey, which is one done across the whole public sector, we always take provision to ensure that any of our staff that don't have access directly on a day-to-day basis to computers, either a given time and access to a computer to undertake that, or we find an alternative mechanism for them to go through. So I should say not just our excellent cleaning staff, but a lot of our catering staff don't access computers on a day-to-day basis as well. So they're also a group that we make sure that they're included.
So you do proactively, because they're obviously here for limited amounts of time.
Yeah.
They don't have a dedicated.
That's exactly right. So, for instance, if we look at the People Matters Employee Survey, which is in the field at the moment, we would make provision within working time for them to either, if they're comfortable with computers, come to a computer and use it to fill out the survey, or try to work with the Public Service Commission to find alternatives if they're not comfortable with the use of computers.
Thank you. Mr. Webb, I just want to come back to the review that's been conducted by Kelly Edwards. So I think earlier you said that the report would be available soon. Can you give some specifics in terms of, are we talking...
This month,
this month?
Yes.
Right.
It will either be late this month or early next month.
Right, I see. And is it the intention that that will be a publicly released report?
Yes.
Right, and so that will then be provided to the union representatives of the staff and subject to further consultation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, Kelly will be making recommendations, and we'll have to look at how to implement those. And some of that will also involve consultation with staff, going through the detail of it. As I said before, some things may require us to put a submission into the Parliamentary Remuneration Tribunal. And again, we would consult on that as well. Some may require changes to the presiding officer's annual determination, which again we'll consult on the detail of that, but we have a more straightforward mechanism for making those adjustments. And if there's a financial impact to anything that Kelly recommends, so for instance, let's say the review of the position descriptions results in a higher salary, we'll obviously have to engage with Treasury around that. We have flagged to Treasury that this is what we're doing, so it will not be a surprise. But we will be seeking the funding to support that increased salary if such a thing is recommended.
Yeah, can you just on that question? So you talked about the Mercer process. Can you just elaborate how that? So is that a component of Ms. Edwards' review, or is that a process that will occur after the review has been
No, she's doing it as a part of the review. So.
Right, so that will effectively job evaluate the positions based on a contemporary sort of assessment of the role.
That's exactly right.
Intention?
That's exactly right. As I said earlier, when it was first raised with former President Ajaka, one of the questions that was asked for was to go back and find out what was the basis of the current salary level, and we could not find any records that indicated what position description was used, what evaluation was used, and indeed in 2014 or 2013, when the MOPS Act was passed, there was a deliberate, explicit carve-out that said that the salary levels would not be re-looked at as a part of that process. So at first we thought, there must have been a process in 2013, 2014, but that was explicitly put to the side and wasn't looked at. So I can't even tell you what the basis was of the current salary levels.
So if Ms. Edwards recommends a salary adjustment, that's within the power of the presiding officers to make a determination to fix a salary at the higher level.
It is, but if it means we don't have enough money anymore, that's why we have to engage with Treasury to make sure that the money also flows. So there'll be two parts to it, looking at the presiding officer's determination and engaging with Treasury to make sure that the money is actually there to pay for the new salary levels. And as it's perhaps a subtle point, but I did want to emphasise, we're not talking about just giving people a pay rise as in doing the same job, getting a pay rise. This is about a re-evaluation of the position, which, as I say, hasn't happened in the entire, well, we can't find records of it happening at all. So we're not sort of seeking this to give everyone a pay rise. What we're seeking to do is evaluate the positions to make sure that people are being paid fairly for the work that they're doing at the moment.
So the scope of this review is to cover both LC and LA staff, is
Correct.
that right?
Yes, while it started with former President Ajaka's commitment in this forum, which obviously related to the Legislative Council staff, the Speaker was supportive of extending it to all member staff. So we've included the LA staff as part of that.
So I know obviously one of the issues that's come out of Broderick is the work health and safety question, and I think we've had some discussion about who the person conducting the business or undertaking is with the duties in relation to staff. Where you've got a member of the Legislative Council who has just one staff, and they are the PCBU, obviously there's an issue there, isn't there, in terms of if the member is the hazard, for example, then you've got a major problem that the hazard is also the PCBU. Is that within the scope of Ms. Edwards' review, looking at that work health and safety? Because obviously that features in terms of the conditions.
Yes, it's within the scope. I'm not sure if she's making any findings in that space. I should say that the work health and safety dimensions of employment of member staff is something that's never been tested in the courts or by the coroner at all. So there is a degree of uncertainty of legal interpretation. We work on the basis that there is a joint responsibility for safety, that the member obviously has some responsibilities around, because you hire, fire, direct the person in how they work, so there's a responsibility there. We as a Parliament obviously have a responsibility to ensure that it's a safe working environment, that that there aren't trip hazards and people have the right equipment to do their job and things along those lines as well. So we work on the basis that there's a joint responsibility for the safety of everybody in the office. But the best definition of where the responsibility for work health and safety lies was given to me by a barrister once, who said it's whoever the coroner decides was responsible. So you just don't know on any given incident.
That doesn't sit very well with the Work Health and Safety Act that's based on prevention, right?
No, that's right. So that's what I think. What the person meant by that is that you can't just make an arbitrary assignment of safety responsibility to a person and then think, oh, good, I'm off the hook. So we take safety extremely seriously, and we assume that we have a responsibility as the administration to do everything we can to make things as safe as they possibly can be, which is one of the reasons why we've been very supportive of this review going through. It is important to us that everyone have safe working conditions as they move forward.
Another element of the safety equation is the issue around late sittings, individual members picking up the following day. Is that within the kind of scope of deliberations for Ms. Edwards' report as well? The whole question, and if there is a recommendation about how you might adjust for that in terms of relief staff or relief arrangements or some kind of hours flexibility. I'm not sure about the mechanism there. Is that contemplation as well?
That is absolutely one of the reasons why I said before that some of it may involve submissions to the PRT, for instance, that if one, and I have not seen the recommendations, so this is speculation on my part, I'll be very clear in saying, but if, for instance, one of the recommendations was that there should be relief arrangements in place for long sitting days, especially for those members that only have one staff, so they can't reasonably organise a staggering of work, some of that may involve us having to go back to the PRT and make a submission to say this. You might recall the LA members used to have a thing called ATS, additional temporary staff, and the thought process was it was 0.4 of an FTE, and it was meant to reflect the additional support that an LA member needed on a sitting day here at Parliament House, so that the electorate office stayed fully staffed through that period. Something like that requires a PRT determination. So it might be a PRT determination. But if there's flexibility, you've pointed to a couple of other potential solutions, flexibility around the scheduling of work or flexible work options. Some of those would sit within the presiding officer's determination. So it will depend a little bit on what Kelly Edwards comes back with, but we're open to all of those suggestions.
If these recommendations are measures to adjust for safety concerns, then there's obviously an immediate issue, isn't there? So is there a capacity for the presiding officers to seek a supplementary determination from the PRT rather than waiting? We've just had the PRT determination come down recently, so it would be another 11 or...
Yes, you're quite right.
Before there could be that adjustment could be made.
The annual determination, you're quite right. The process will start soon, but the actual determination isn't handed down until June next year. There are provisions under the Act for a special request to be put through. I don't think from memory that the presiding officers can make that.
I think it's the Premier.
It's the Premier, I think, that can, maybe the Attorney General as well. I'd have to check on that. But there are provisions for within the year determinations to be given by the PRT. So we would investigate that. Depending, again, it depends on the nature of Ms. Edwards' recommendations.
What's the timetable if she recommends an adjustment to salary? Will that be an immediate, or is there some?
I think the default position would be that we'd have to put a submission into Treasury, so it wouldn't take effect till the following July. We could attempt to do something in advance of that, but the default processes that we have access to are all based around the financial year. So I couldn't guarantee anything.
It does create a problem, doesn't it? If you make a work determination or
Yes.
work value determination,
Yeah.
say the work is worth this,
Yeah.
we can only pay you this, then surely
Yes.
that gives rise to some back claim, doesn't it?
We would absolutely be looking at all of that and trying to make things happen as quickly as possible. I just know that the default process is an annual financial year process.
So just on that point, in the event that we can't get an interim sort of fix, would there be a commitment to backdate based on the evaluation date?
That would be what we would put. That would be the submission that we would make to Treasury. Would be exactly that. We would have the date at which we accepted the recommendation, and that's the submission we would make to Treasury.
Just on that view again, one of the themes of the Broderick Review was the lack of any real protected pathway for members, staff and their union representatives to negotiate or consult on their working conditions, and the likelihood that this has led to significant shortfalls in pay. Can we commit that we're going to negotiate with members, staff and their representatives on improving working conditions?
Essentially, this is what the Edwards Review, that's why we said with the Edwards Review not to just focus on salary, but to focus on the full conditions of employment of members' staff. So yes, we do have a commitment to do that.
But I mean, there's a two-step thing here. There's the job evaluation process.
And there's conditions of employment.
And then there's conditions, but there's also there's the lack of a jurisdictional oversight for bargaining. So in a normal workplace, unions would collectivise and say, well, we reckon we're worth this.
And that's a provision under the Act, so there would have to be legislative change. The lack of access to the Industrial Relations Commission, for instance, that this is all
part of
dictated
the
by the
purview,
Act.
isn't it?
Yeah, so that would have to be looked at as part of it.
Presiding officers could, as a matter of policy, adopt a collective bargaining approach.
I think that's
in terms
the essence of the
determination.
question, yeah.
Is that something that the presiding officers have contemplated or are prepared to do?
Let's see what Kelly Edwards' report says.
So I'm very interested to get the view on this, because if the report comes out and says, look, we've got the Mercer Spectrum going, the job's worth X, but staff and their unions think, well, we should have the right to collectively organise like we do in other workplaces, and as my colleague points out, you could take the view that, well, okay, let's go down that approach, even though there's no jurisdictional enforcement.
Something I'm happy to look at, not something I've contemplated, I would say, up until now, so I don't have an answer to give you off the top of my head, but something I'd be happy to have a look at and provide advice to the presiding officers.
Are you able to provide stats on full-time equivalent numbers of middle and upper management from 2019 to the present?
I can't off the top of my head, but I can take that on notice.
Okay. What about FTEs of people in frontline roles? That is not upper and middle. Same? Or no?
Yeah, I certainly take that on notice, not figures I have in front of me.
List of all DPS employment grades by the number of staff in each grade.
Certainly provide that. I think we provided that last time unnoticed, so happy to do so again.
Yeah, this would be an update of that.
Yep.
The overall level of non-member full-time equivalents.
So that would be including members, staff, but not members themselves. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And so you'd want to see the departmental full-time equivalents plus the member staff full-time equivalents, but not anything to do with members.
Correct.
Right? Okay. Yep.
By the Parliament for FY 2022-23 compared to 2021-22, I guess. Well, 2022-23 hasn't finished yet, so we'd have to project.
Yeah, we could do a point in time. As of whenever we run the numbers.
Can I ask if there's been any budget cuts made to Hansard in the current financial year?
We're in the process of allocating the budget. There's been no staffing cuts with Hansard at all. No, we do look for efficiencies across the DPS budget in a very small amount, just so we can reinvest in other parts if we need to. I think Hansard made a small contribution to that, but it's not material and didn't impact anybody's employment.
There may have been a small budget cut, but it hasn't resulted in
no staffing impact. I would just highlight, and I know this committee's heard this before, but we have almost doubled the size of Hansard in the last few years, so up from 20-odd FTE to in the mid-30s FTE in Hansard. But
what was that again, Mark? Sorry.
Jocelyn will grab the exact numbers for me, but it was roughly 21 FTE a few years ago. It's now 36 FTE, if I'm remembering correctly. But many of those positions are, thank you, FTE of 21 in 2017-18, and we're now at 33.6 FTE, so 21 to 33.6. But I would note the Hansard team does excellent work, but many of those positions are funded by temporary money, so people are in temporary positions because we get say 2 years worth of funding from Treasury. We are making.
So that leads to my next. So that just on that point. So, in terms of structural vacancies, how many are there?
In terms of the full-time, like the permanent roles, we fill them as soon as they open, and we have a steady supply of people because we have a lot of people in temporary roles who obviously move straight into the full-time roles. We then immediately do a recruitment for the temporary vacancies that have opened up. So at any given time there might be a bit of frictional vacancy, i.e. we've got a recruitment process underway, but we know how much work the Hansard team have to do. And
just to put into context, Mr. Webb, if that temporary money were to dry up, you would essentially be back to baseline structural FTE, which is, are we talking about that?
Yeah, it's in the early 20s, 2023, I think, something along those lines. I'd have to.
Have there been any recommendations to recognise the permanent structural shift to that higher FTE?
Yes, we have made those submissions. The latest feedback we received was that we will be making the submissions again. People want to see the result of the election to see if the level of activity that's currently driving these extra numbers continues into the next Parliament. I have personally said yes, it will, but they do want to see what the result of the election is.
We will be close to perfection, so it may not be required. But
yes. Well, if there is a change of government, I look forward to the Treasurer supporting the.
I have the election optimism.
All right. So,
but yes, we put submissions in every year, and we will continue to do so. The Hansard team does excellent.
You've been getting knocked.
We've been getting temporary money, so we haven't been getting knocked back, but we've only been given.
That's the permanent structural recognition in the budget has been.
That's not happened.
What? How many years in a row now?
A few now. The ask has gone up every year for the last few years. As the refer to the earlier line of questioning about the level of activity in things like committees, doesn't only have an impact on David's team. Of course, the Hansard team are very impacted by that as well. So it's grown year on year for the last couple of years. For instance, it was as I said, it was 21 a few years ago. Went up to 24 in 2019, 20, 30 in 2021, 22, and now at 33.6. So it's been growing. And as I say, each of our submissions have been approved but for temporary money.
So this is all driven by the increase in transcription for committees. Is that's
yes.
the driver?
That's one of the
Not
drivers.
sitting
yes.
And it's
long
also
sittings.
being driven by longer sitting hours.
On the sitting hours as well.
So we've gone from an average sitting day of something like 7 hours in the last parliamentary term to an average of 10 hours.
Yeah. So that And the other thing we've been doing to try and support the Hansard team is investing in the technology that they can use. We've got a couple more components to adjust, but soon a Hansard person would be able to do the transcription service from home. So, for instance, that will give us the ability to do things like people going home over the dinner break, so travelling when they're not tired, continuing transcription at home in the evenings, and then being able to go straight to bed rather than leaving the Parliament at 1 o'clock in the morning and being tired on the journey home. So we're trying to look for not just staffing, but also ways that we can invest in technology and other things to make it as safe as possible for the Hansard team to do their job and as flexible as possible. It might also open up opportunities for us to find the Hansard team, they're real experts in what they do, and it's not just so you can go out and click your fingers and find somebody that can do the job of a Hansard person. They do fantastic work. I mean, they're having to transcribe me now. That's a feat in and of itself. So we want to make sure that we can grab onto as many people as possible. If there's someone that lived in regional New South Wales and we have this technology right, they could potentially do the Hansard transcription service from Orange or from Dubbo or something like that. So it will give us the maximum flexibility to find people as well as safety. As I say, I'd much rather people travelling home at 7 o'clock be back at home by 8 o'clock, have some dinner, and then do transcription and then go straight to bed, as opposed to being here till 1 o'clock in the morning and stepping out onto Macquarie Street at 1 o'clock in the morning. And indeed, I would take the opportunity to, I think the move to the 10 o'clock hard has made a big difference for the safety of the Hansard people, because keep in mind they were here for 3 hours after you rose. So if you rose at 12:30, they were here at 3:30 finishing the transcription, because we try and hit this time frame of having it done within 3 hours.
You alluded earlier in your answer to the depth of the skill sets required. What is that like? And are people skilled in Hansard and trained in Hansard readily available in the marketplace?
I would say not readily available in the marketplace. It's not just a matter of, say, being a fast typer there's an interpretive element to Hansard, like when there is when kerfuffle ensues in the chamber, when there are a lot of people talking at the same time. David has pointed to the transcription of the election of the president as a great example of that interpretive side of things. There was a lot going on, and it's hard to work out what's going on. So it's not just a matter of taking, that's right. Yes, kerfuffle ensued. There are a series.
I did suggest at a recent presiding officers and clerks conference that if there was a specialist Booker Prize for dialogue, then there's about 5 pages of that transcript that I would like to submit for that award.
I greatly admire the transcription of that.
Yes, that's right. So
all of us who were involved in it.
Yeah, so we look at places, so obviously other parliaments, for a little while there was a lot of people retiring from Canberra looking to move to Sydney in their retirement. They would come in and work for us for a period of time. But that kind of dried up.
What's the training environment?
Yeah, so I want to give a shout out to the Deputy Editor of Debates, Karen, for the work she's done in this space. So there is an intensive multi-month process where a new person coming into Hansard is trained in how to be a good Hansard operator. I would say that when that supply of people from Canberra dried up, the whole Hansard team did a fantastic job in quantifying what they do, preparing induction materials and guides. So essentially people go between 3 and 6 month sort of apprenticeship, if you want to call it that. We look at things like people that do closed captioning. There's people that work for firms that do closed captioning. That can be a good starting point. People that have a journalism and a background can be a good space. People who've worked in publishing can be a good, because it's no longer shorthand or the speed at which you do stenography or things along those lines. Most of the Hansard operators re-speak what's said using software like Dragon Dictate to re-speak what's being said and capture it that way. It is that interpretive element, being able to keep up understanding the parliamentary processes and being able to understand what is actually going on. I think people sometimes misinterpret Hansard as kind of like a typing pool, but it is so much more than that, and the team does such fantastic work. So we're very much dedicated to pick up your earlier line of questioning to securing the permanent funding, to make sure we're investing in the technology to both help people do their job and keep them safe, but also this investment in training and development and giving people those good pathways into Hansard. And the people in the Hansard team also go on to do fantastic work in other aspects of the Parliament as well. We've had people go from Hansard into the education and engagement space. We've had people go from Hansard. In fact, one of the key people that's been working on the technology for the Macquarie Room and some of the other spaces is a Hansard person who brings expertise from the outside, but also is making sure that what we are doing. In fact, our former editor of debates moved over to run that project, Scott Fuller. So it's not just a contribution they make to Hansard, but a broader contribution to the Parliament as well. That this team is doing fantastic work. So.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webb. We might have a break now and reconvene at, say, 20 minutes past 11.
Sounds good, Chair.
Excellent.
Is it like just soap and maple?
Okay, we might recommence, please. Just might mention, I was reminded by Hansard, given the nature of the temporary nature of the broadcast system we're using, if you have to cough or sneeze, please turn away from the microphone because they can't hear what's being said. Sorry?
Sure thing.
Sure thing?
I was talking to us, right?
Even better, don't ask questions. Mr. President, well, that's what the government normally does. They don't ask questions. Mr. President, can you give us an update in terms of the review on sessional and standing orders that we've been progressing through in the current Parliament?
Certainly. The sessional orders have been, as members would be aware, they're in play in the chamber. So in that regard, we're looking at sort of working towards the finalisation of those sessional orders and turning them into a final set of new standing orders. So working back from the end of the year.
When is that to be?
Well, that will be sort of working back from the end of the year, where obviously the governor they need to be presented to the governor. Just simply at the moment going through a backdating process to ensure that there's enough time on the front end to ensure we get delivery of those standing orders to the governor. So that process starts the clerk while we're away to work up a timeline in that regard, so as we ensure that those standing orders can be signed off at the end of the year, so they're ready for the next parliamentary term. So what the expectation is that obviously with sitting in November, that with the procedure committee would need to re-institute its inquiry to look at any other suggested changes to the current set of sessional orders, and any other amendments or additions that the procedure committee would need to consider in order to get a sign-off and then bring it back to the House for...
That's really what I was getting to, the fine-tuning.
Yes. So I think the timing, we're looking at having a procedure committee meeting in the September sittings to confirm a number of outstanding matters, including the timing for the finalisation of the sessional order review and the finalisation of the new standing orders.
Okay, thank you. Just in relation to the legislature budget, I know under the previous president he always used to have problems with having enough money to do what he wanted to do. I'm not hearing that same level of angst coming from you or from Mr. Webb. Are we to assume that the government has learned its lesson, are supplying sufficient funding for the legislature?
Well, look, I think there's always room to do more if you have more to do it with. Obviously, the capital work side of things is probably the area where we've most been short over a number of years. So I think at the last estimates hearing...
Well, I'll come to capital budget in a few minutes. I'm talking more of the operational stuff. I mean, you talk about temporary roles, for example, earlier in your answer to the question in relation to Hansard. What about the overall monies that are required to run the Parliament itself, especially given repairs and maintenance is not necessarily capital works?
Yes. Look, in terms of that, we have been pretty successful in the last budget round in terms of the Expenditure Review Committee in difficult circumstances, so far as ensuring that we're able to actually be successful in having most of our budget bids approved. I've got to say they weren't all approved, but in terms of the detail, I might ask Mr. Webb to respond to that, but suffice to say that I think operationally, so far as recurrent funding as opposed to capital funding, I think we're in a reasonable place. But having said that, there are certain issues that we haven't received funding for, or we have received interim funding for, which is similar to the experience we've just gone through in relation to Hansard or the committee staffing, where we don't get the full-time equivalent, we get temporary funding which will be reviewed. So that sort of unstable funding base is always a concern, but again that will again come up through the budget process post the next election. But those initial comments, perhaps Mr. Webb, would you like to add anything else, or indeed you, David, as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably the way I would characterise it, Mr. Borzak, is that we've stopped the bleeding. So you might recall that we used to lose a fair chunk of our budget every year, and that meant we were continuing to make cuts. Having to cut back on staff.
Are you still subjected to a efficiency?
No, we invited Treasury in a couple of years ago, and we said we're an open book. Come in and have a look at how we operate. Show us where these efficiencies are. The conclusion that came out of that was that, considering the lack of investment that had happened over decades, that we were operating as efficiently as we could. So that we have not had our budget cut in the last few years. But what we're seeking is the kind of investment. So, for instance, it's boring stuff for most members, but the system that we use to run payroll and pay our accounts and the rest is 20-something.
Until people don't get paid.
Yes, exactly. That would be exactly my point. So, investment in those areas, we do have a lot of processes that are quite manual at the moment, and investment in those kind of systems would help in that space. What that hasn't done is restored previous cuts or the like. So what we have been doing is looking at particular areas. We talked about Hansard before the break. The Broderick review does provide an opportunity to relook at the resources we have available for in the HR space and the like. We're basically looking for opportunities to review the resourcing that we have in various aspects of the department and try and put them on an even footing. And as I said, associated with Hansard, also look to where we've been getting temporary money and where we think the demand is ongoing, which I think in Hansard it is, seeking to put the case that those should be converted to ongoing funding rather than having to renew it every couple of years. So the bleeding stopped, but the restoration process is still in case. And just to give you a sense of that in a broad sense, I'll turn over to David. We depreciate in today's dollars at about $15 to $17 million a year. In today's dollars, in the 2000 to 2010 period, the average investment in the Parliament against that $15 to $17 million worth of depreciation was $3 million. Now, I'm not a financial genius, that's why I've got Jocelyn here, but you don't have to be a financial genius to work out that $15, $16 million worth of going backwards is not offset by $3 million worth of investment. We are paying the price for that, and I would acknowledge at this point we're having to catch up, and I know that catching up means it's more disruptive. The work we're doing is more disruptive than it would have otherwise been if there had been steady investment in the Parliament over that period. But David, I know you wanted to talk to the point.
Just very briefly on operational funding for the Department of the Legislative Council to support you all in your work both in the Chamber and committees. As I indicated before, we have received funding from Treasury in incremental steps over the last 4 years, but it is still temporary. I think the latest is that we've actually been given 2 years, so this financial year and the next one. They are very keen to see what the outcome of the election is for what the makeup of the Legislative Council will be and what implications that will have for committee workloads and other things that the Legislative Council does. Like Mr Webb, I'm confident that the robust and interesting and creative use of procedures by members is likely to continue into the next term, not diminish. So that's committee. So we'll be making that submission for that funding to become permanent as soon as we can. The other area of the Department of the Legislative Council operations is the Procedure Office. We haven't put in similar incremental funding bids over the last 4 years. I do have a sort of root and branch review of the Procedure Office underway at the moment, and I would be surprised if the outcome of that was not a similar parameter and technical adjustment bid for some incremental increase in support in that area, which we would put in the next budget round.
Okay, thank you. Just to hark back for a minute to the Broderick report, and my friend here, Mr. Lathan, raised it, but I thought what I would do is just read onto the Hansard my response to the Premier's email to us party leaders to help support the process. And I might say at the outset that we do support the process, but all the comments seems to be on the basis that we're all equally guilty of something, or perhaps something that we don't know about, or perhaps something that may have been done. And my response on behalf of our party is couched in that way, and it goes like this. The Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party consents to participate in the response to the Broderick report in a multi-partisan way as requested by the Premier. However, we note that our party already conducts itself and its internal affairs with the utmost respect and consideration of its staff, representative members and all others in Macquarie Street and elsewhere. I am not aware of any of our staff or members having grounds or circumstances for making any complaints. The way this has been handled by the Premier has been procedurally unfair and belittling to our party and its staff and members. To cast us all and judge all our members and staff in Macquarie Street and elected officers by the disgustingly low standards of this government is unacceptable to us. The culture that this government has accepted for too long has brought us all into disrepute and must stop. It's simply not good enough to cast a pall of disrepute over us all. It is in this spirit that we will be participating in an effort at working to improve and lift the collective standards in the future. We call on the government to acknowledge that not all are as bad as his coalition government appear to be. And that's just not a political statement. That's a statement from the heart of our party after we sat down and spoke about it. This whole process, as good and commendable as it can and should be, in my reading of the report, especially in relation to the recommendation, there's only one small paragraph that says most people were happy with what's going on, and the whole lot and the rest of it is a huge attack on all of us in here when all of us aren't equally guilty. I have to go out into the public now and explain myself why, as a Member of Parliament, somehow or other, I'm some sort of grub. And I don't accept that. And the more acknowledgement should be given to those of us that have done the right thing, as opposed to only focusing on those that have done the wrong thing.
Hear, hear.
That's my response. Sue?
I would just like to raise an operational matter, if that's possible, and it is in relation to the paper that we use in the Parliament. And it may seem insignificant, but it's terrifically significant, and that is that we do supply what is referred to as 100% recycled paper. It's a Reflex brand. Many people would not realise, though, that that is actually paper that is still coming out of the Victorian native forests. At the moment, those forests are suffering dramatically. We're going to see the end of the logging of those forests at some point. The Premier down there has acknowledged that. But at the moment, there is an incredible debate going on about the future of some of the threatened species that reside only in those forests, some of the rarest animals on Earth. And unfortunately, that 100% recycled paper does still come from those forests. There is now an incredible stream of much more responsible paper to be sourced, 100% post-consumer recycled paper. And if it is at all possible, it would be wonderful if this great place could look at possibly going that one step higher for us and future generations and the survival of some of these creatures that don't have a voice at all. Because
Is that paper made in Australia, or has it got to be imported?
There are some that are made in Australia.
They can only be made in Australia.
There are some. There are absolutely
Made
papers.
in New South Wales.
Made in New South Wales.
I would suggest that is something.
Made in China.
That is something that the wonderful staff here can look at. And it is literally just to put on the record that we are currently still responsible for using materials from our incredibly valuable public forest estate that is the home to these threatened species. Not only are there 100% post-consumer recycled papers that are made in Australia, there's some that are supplied from First Nations corporations as well. There's a lot of work happening in that space, and it would be so good for all of us if we were part of it. And that's all I would add for now. Thank you.
Very, very happy to look at that. I would also just encourage, we've been doing a lot of work on digitisation recently to try and cut down the use of paper completely. If you come up to visit me on level 9, you'll see that the compactus that was there has just been taken out because we have digitised all financial and HR records across the Parliament. So we're also seeking to just reduce our paper use generally but very happy to look into this particular issue for where paper is still used. And I am conscious that I am sitting in front of a giant folder of paper as I say all that. So.
Thank you very much.
Chair, could I ask how the membership of the advisory group on bullying, sexual harassment and serious misconduct was determined?
That was before my time, but I might ask Mr Webb to look at that. I understand it was drawn from all parts of the Parliament, but exactly as to which members where, I think that was a process. I might ask
was there a vetting process, given that these were going to be 8 MPs, in particular, passing judgment on the rest of us via the Broderick process?
In terms of the members, we did not undertake a vetting process for those members, no. As was pointed out earlier, the advisory group also has staff representatives, so the 2 clerks and I look to make sure that our representatives were people that we were...
I pass no judgment on any of the staff representatives, but I know reasonably well the 8 MPs listed, so there was no character test, no seeking out the better angels in the place, that these MPs would pass judgment from their own moral standing on the rest of us?
Well, we did not.
No, you didn't do that?
Review, no.
President, are you confident that the 8 were suitable representatives to pass these judgments, and the point that was made by the Chair about how we've all been smeared by the Broderick report, even those of us who don't?
I don't recall being asked to participate.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the process behind that. It was, as I said, before my time as President, but I wouldn't characterise it as passing judgment. The advisory group, if you look at their terms of reference...
You read the media?
If you look at the terms of reference and you look at what their role is to provide advice to the Parliamentary Executive Group, and obviously the Broderick process has been an independent process which has been done by Elizabeth Broderick in consultation and close consultation at times with the Parliamentary Advisory Group and some consultation with the Parliamentary Executive Group. But it's been a very independent process, and that was really important, that it was done independently, and that there was confidence in that independent process from all those staff members and other people who have been affected, so that they were able then to confidently contact and interact with that process without it having any impact.
Well, yeah. Are you confident that this member should have sat on an advisory group for serious misconduct, who we saw in the staff bar that night, paralytically drunk, as drunk as anyone I've ever seen in my long time working in a Parliament House, screaming into her phone, "You're too effing good for him, you're too effing good for him," the member for Shell Harbour? Do you really think she should have been on an advisory group judging the rest of us for serious misconduct?
This is budget estimates. It's not an opportunity for a member to launch into a personal attack on a member. He knows the standing orders.
What's this thing?
If he's going to do that, he needs to do it by way of substantive motion in the House and not use this process for that purpose.
Well, was there a security report later that night concerning the way in which parliamentary staff had to stand in front of the car of this particular member to stop her from driving home in this paralytically drunk state?
I'm not aware, but I might ask Mr Webb to comment.
I'm not aware of any security report along those lines.
You take it on notice and check the records. And in particular, the Broderick report at page 7 refers to training needed for our special constables, how to deal with situations classified as trauma-informed responses. Was that a reference to the member for Shell Harbour?
I'm going to object.
Her disgraceful conduct that night. So drunk she could barely stand up.
This line of questioning
tried to
is
drive
filled
home.
with assumptions that are not subject to any testing. You're making assertions about a member. The member is not in a position to defend themselves. You should desist from this line of questioning. It's out of order.
I'm asking questions about someone on an advisory group for serious misconduct who had the hide. The absolute hide to get on a group passing judgment about the rest of us. Given the fact in the bar that night she could barely stand up.
Based on
President, you were there, you must acknowledge it was disgraceful conduct. And she should never have been on this group. Should never have been on this group.
This is now out of control. The member continues to reflect on another member, and he knows very well that it's not in order.
It mustn't reflect on another member unless it's by substantive motion.
Well, what about a former member? How did the notorious drunk Catherine Cusack get on this group, given that in our chamber it was an open secret? she brought more shame and disgrace
I'm going to take a point
and
of order
embarrassment
again.
to the Legislative
Just
Council
use
with her
this
behaviour that was
proceeding.
persistently drunk.
I'm taking a
How did
point of
she
order.
get
I'm
on
taking a
group
point of order. I
about
should be
serious
heard.
misconduct
Point of
and
order.
is now in the media
Respect the
holier than
process.
thou trying to
Respect the
pass
process.
judgment on us.
Respect
She's
the
a former
Member
process.
knows that this is not an opportunity for him to make allegations and assertions about members or former members of
Why
this
not?
House.
What's this thing about?
Let's,
What's this thing about?
I'll uphold the point
What
of
about
order.
your colleagues who've been rubbed out?
I'll uphold the point of order. Please try and desist from naming names.
Well, one that's been named in the media already is the member for Newtown, who I will defend. But in my assessment, she wouldn't be a bully. She'd be intense, engaged and energetic in representing the seat of Newtown. Why is it that she's been outed apparently as allegedly as a bully, when at page 34 of the Broderick Review, the bar is set so low for what bullying might be? Bullying is listed as criticism, complaints, saying to someone, we might have to sack you because you're incompetent, pranks and jokes, moving stuff on their desk, a quote, setting meaningless tasks, and spreading misinformation. Isn't, in the eye of the beholder, all of politics about misinformation? Labor will say that about Liberal and vice versa. I mean, isn't it a joke to say that these classifications can be regarded as bullying, and for political reasons staff are invited to lodge through the media or these processes, Broderick or Rose Webb, complaints about a member of Parliament for political reasons?
The reality is, if you look at page 34, there are items, there are examples of bullying behaviour listed. We're talking about unjustified criticism or complaints, not just criticism. So I think when you look through that,
Well, who judges that? Who judges what's justified and unjustified in an
This is in
office?
relation to a survey that was conducted independently by Elizabeth Broderick, according to standards set and as part of the review that was conducted. So in that regard, these numbers here are responses to the questions that were put in the context of that survey.
Do you acknowledge that the threshold is so low that these are not acts of bullying, these are just the regular activities in an office, where if a staff member is incompetent, you might have to say you've got to lift your game or you have to go. How can that be regarded as bullying? What sort of snowflake parliament and building are we creating here, President?
I think behaviour or language that frightens, humiliates,
No,
degrades,
they're not the questions
including
I raised.
criticism that is delivered with yelling or screaming. They're
They're not the matters I've raised. I've raised stuff that's absolutely trivial, and under these categories, Leong here has probably been fitted up, and as has Mihalik and Secord, and where's the apology to these members that without any proof of such a low threshold, these people have been vilified in the public arena?
This goes to the statement I read earlier. This now is applying to all of us. Automatically, we're all assumed guilty, even if we've had nothing to do with it and have no intent, and our organisations and structures are being run properly. What really should be happening is the Broderick report should be looking into the activities of the major parties. That's actually what
And the two known drunks were
People
allowed to
actually
stay
run
on the
place.
committee.
And the opposition.
Two who had something to answer,
Point of
passing
order.
judgment on everyone else.
The member
the two
knows
drunks.
he's been called to restrain himself from persisting with these untested allegations.
I was there and the President was there. And you know about Cusack, don't you?
Order.
This business.
Now, in,
How about dealing in truth?
now in your time, Sue.
Other than smear.
That's not smear, it's truth.
I think we're in the opposition time.
No, it's government talk.
Can I just,
President was
can I
there,
just,
I was there, you've all been there for Cusack.
can I
Come
just
on.
take
Government
1
time,
second?
Government time. Oh, okay. Now
Can
we're
we,
government time.
just for 1 second, can we just possibly recalibrate for 1 second and acknowledge that the report focuses on victims, and let's move on from there. Thank you.
Your colleague Leong.
Well,
And my colleague has said in the media that as a political party, and not a major one, we support and encourage all complainants coming forward at any time and to any place they feel they need to come forward to. Thank you, Chair.
I echo that sentiment, and our party would too. I also regret the focus that minor parties now, and participants in minor parties such as myself and Mr Latham and many others, are now also part of a smear campaign that's being run by the major parties seeking to try to offset blame for their activities and lack of internal discipline to all of us in this place. It's unacceptable, totally unacceptable. I don't care what the major parties say.
All right, well, with all due respect, we're in government time now.
No, you're not in government time, so I haven't.
No, we are in government time.
You're not in government time yet. I'll switch that on when I'm finished. The minor parties don't often get a chance to point the finger of blame to where it belongs, and in this particular case, it belongs in the Premier's office. We're now dragging us all along down into his cesspool of blame.
Is that why Helen Dalton left the shooters?
It's the people who commissioned Broderick.
Oh, okay, that's good.
You know
Gave them the
you know
report that
very
they
well.
wanted.
Don't play politics on this.
No,
You've got to be
The
kidding
reality
me.
is,
Let's
this is
rewind.
being used
Let's
and
rewind
twisted
back
by the government somehow or other to virtue signal their own lack of good governance.
We
in
have
their
the
own party.
legislature here.
All right.
Let's focus.
Okay, if I could just make a brief comment. This is an independent, credible report. The reality is that most respondents to this report are very positive about the environment they work in. Their focus in relation to
One paragraph that says that.
well,
and the rest of the
there's a
report
few
is
paragraphs
busy
that says that, but then
telling us what all the
then
problems are.
as a couple of members have mentioned, there's a focus in, if you like, on those people that have been affected, and what we're looking to do is create a safe environment for people who come to work in Parliament, so they feel secure, they feel valued, and they feel included. That's what this is all about. So what we're going to be doing is going through this. Obviously, there are some people that have been seriously affected. We acknowledge that. We want to ensure that the environment moving forward is as secure and safe and inclusive as it possibly can be. This needs to be an exemplar of a workplace, an example for all of New South Wales, and we'll be doing whatever we can to ensure that happens in consultation with all members, in consultation with the leadership of parties, in consultation with the Parliamentary Advisory Group and all stakeholders.
Government time.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Higginson actually, a moment ago, alluded to supporting complainants. So I'll turn to one that I know of, and that's me. And I know, Mr President and Mr Webb, you'll surely know where this is going. For context for other members and anyone watching, before coming to this place, I never, ever needed a papa. Since being elected and working in this building, I have to carry this inhaler with me whenever I'm here for sitting weeks or committee work or estimates weeks that we've just been through. Never needed it before, and to be frank, when Parliament is in recess and I'm out and about in the community across the Hunter and in the Central Coast mainly, or on committee work throughout the state, I don't need this. I only need an inhaler when I'm in this building. And that comes about mainly due to the water damage and the ensuing mould throughout the building, but particularly down in level 7 in the LC chamber itself, in the members' lounge next door, in the Parks room, which I know has been rehabilitated lately, particularly in the Jubilee room, which has sustained a lot of water damage lately, and that's a long-standing problem. Other colleagues and staff members, to be frank, of course, who I won't name as staff members, but many members have also raised their concerns for their health, and former members as well, can I say. If we could start, I'd like to particularly ask about that water damage in the Jubilee room. It's been an ongoing problem, as we all know, and I know that there has been some work. Mr Webb, thank you for your engagement, your communication on that issue. Are you able to expand on what's happened and what's happening?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So on the specific issue, the most recent issues we had with the Jubilee room came from a blockage in some of the pipework above the Jubilee room, which caused the water to back up and then spill essentially over into the Jubilee room. So that, obviously that causal factor has been rectified, and we have gone through and done mould remediation in the room. But as you quite rightly point out, across the entire Hospital part of the building, including the, strictly speaking, the Jubilee room is not part of the Hospital, but including the Jubilee room, we do have an ongoing issue with mould and with other particulates throughout the session. One of in the break that's coming up at the end of the year, when you all leave and are out on the hustings and doing your thing, We will be doing a major piece of work across the whole front of the building, and that will involve extensive mould remediation works and other remediation works. The primary issue that we've found is that under these buildings is where the mould is thriving. So there's a cavity underneath the LC chamber. Below the Parks room, there's a couple of little rooms down there. Similarly, below the LA chamber, there's space down there. The works that we're looking at will work to essentially have ways of drying out all of that space to ensure that they're not set up for mould or providing the conditions under which mould thrives into the future. We're also, I think you would have all noticed in the chamber, it's been quite some time since there's been restoration works throughout the chamber. There's wallpaper that's peeling from the wall. If you look carefully at the colours of the various benches, they're all slightly different shades of red and different
So what?
different levels
Spend
of.
this money where it's needed, out in country hospitals or suburban roads. I mean, this is just an indulgence. Different coloured leather. Who cares?
Government time.
Well, I haven't noticed. He's asking us if we noticed. The answer's no.
Oh, Mark, there's a very small part of a much larger problem.
Yes, it is. But we are looking at trying to clear out and make sure that this the issue that you quite rightly point to is sorted out as part of this work. The focus of the works we're doing are on safety remediation and making sure that the space is fit for purpose, not just now, but into the future as well. If the building survived for 200 years, if we want it to be the Parliament for the next 200, we need to do these kind of works.
Thank you. Mr. President, do you have anything to add? Or
Oh, look, it's going to be very significant sort of range of work, as Mark has said. So it's going to cause a bit more inconvenience to members, I'm sorry to say. But as part of that, I think it's essential that we embark on a lot of that work that's been ignored for a long time and has simply been a backlog that is now affecting the health of members. And I'm another person affected by this as well. So I've been a very strong advocate, and as part of the funding for the current this financial year and into next financial year, there'll be significant funding to fix these long-standing problems. And that's just the nature of working in a heritage building, which is subject to the water damage that's occurred over time, but also there are problems with the original construction that we're finding as we're working through this process that need to be remedied if this is going to be a Parliament for the next 200 years.
Thank you. Mr. Webb, just at the start of your answer to my first question, you mentioned particulate matter. Is that something that...
Yeah, so the mould is the primary issue that we've found. There's no, I was perhaps unnecessarily alarming in saying that. There's no poisonous or hazardous particulate matter, so we're not talking about asbestos or anything along those lines. So, but there's significant accumulation of dust in various parts of the building that's very hard to get to and almost impossible to clean.
Okay.
So there are parts of that hospital area where the air quality is slightly lower than what we would expect in a sort of a modern kind of workplace. And I know that in terms of allergic, allergies and those kind of reactions, it's not just mold. It could just be dust, particulates.
Dust mites,
well.
a whole range of things.
That's right.
And I feel like the canary in this proverbial coal mine.
If you ever decide to give up politics, I think you could rent yourself out as a mould across the board. So.
But look, one of the key elements of this sort of refurbishment will be upgrading the air conditioning system and putting in dehumidifying aspects so that we can actually pull that water out. And if you look at how much water comes out that we're extracting, we have dehumidifiers in the chamber. We can. I mean, it's an extraordinary amount of water that's floating around the place. Something like 21 litres overnight on a regular basis of water just being pulled out of the Legislative Council environment. It's quite extraordinary, and that's the sort of thing that
shows how much hot air's in there, isn't it?
Well, a lot of water vapour, nothing else.
So, in regards to the air quality in particular, how often is the air quality tested? Are there spore tests of sorts? And does this happen periodically? Is it scheduled? Does it happen when there's an incident?
The answer is both. We have a regular regime of testing. I'm sure the crack squad behind me will be able to tell me the frequency before I finish my answer.
If not, happy to take anything on notice.
Yes, that's right. So we do have a regular regime of air quality testing that does include spore testing as well. But especially in the last 12 months, we've had to supplement that with additional testing when we've had some of the large rain events. You might have noticed there was a point in which all the photos came down in the little corridor going out with the former presidents. That's because we found visible mould through that whole area and had to remediate that space as well. And we did air quality testing as a part of that work too. So we do have a regular regime, but we are finding we're having to do more and more air quality testing that is in excess of that regular regime as well.
And I take it that there's a third party that's brought in to do the testing. Would their report be something that you're able to produce on notice to this committee?
Happy to.
Thank you. That would be much appreciated.
6 monthly.
Okay, thank you very much.
The regular regime is 6 monthly.
Thank you very much. So stepping back from just this particular issue that I've raised, what challenges do you have in running, maintaining a building of such heritage value, which is still utilised as a full-time building as this is?
There's a few challenges. You're quite right. The balance between heritage, security, accessibility, and then operations is, especially in the front of the building, is particularly difficult. But people often don't realise that the entire building has a heritage order on it. Some parts are considered more acute heritage areas. Of course, the 206-year-old Rum Hospital being a prime example of that. But even the 1970s Tower Block is considered to have heritage value. So that balancing of all of those things together is difficult. Part of the difficulty that we have is in, rather than having a steady stream of investment over a long period of time, we have sort of a feast and famine approach. Nothing for a long time, and then some money comes in, and so that can cause more disruption to members and to the operation of the place because we're not doing smaller amounts of regular maintenance. If I can give an example from another jurisdiction, the Victorian Parliament is just in the process of completing a 15-year project to restore all the stoneworks around. They were able to do that because they had that ability to project what was needed and had the funding in place that allowed them to do a small amount of work each year, rather than if we were to try and do something similar, we would be given 2, maybe 3 years worth of funding, and we would have to do the entire building in 2 or 3 years. So that capacity to schedule out work in the longer term and try and do it in a way that's not that minimises disruption to the Parliament is one of the challenges for us. I guess the other challenge for us is looking into the future and trying to actually predict. I mentioned before, what would happen if all LC members were to get 2 staffers, and then say crossbenchers were to move to 3 staffers. You've got the New South Wales population is growing. Does that mean in the future there might be more members of Parliament? If you want to keep the ratio in the lower house, for instance, between members of Parliament and sizes of electorate consistent, you would end up needing more members. If you're going to keep the number of members constant, then those members will end up with bigger electorates. Either way, more resources are going to be required, either more staff or more members down the track. So I think, and part of the leadership of the President and the Speaker has been about instructing us to look into the future and say, well, what is the long-term use of this space, and how do we undertake planning that will think about the long-term needs of the building, not just fixing up what's here today. So in summary, we're doing rectification works around areas of neglect. We're doing works to try and make sure that the current Parliament can do its job. So I refer to our discussion about committee resources, committee hearing rooms, for instance, earlier. And we're trying to look into the future to predict what might be required so that we can do things proactively rather than reacting after the case with all the disruption that entails.
Thank you. Did either of you? Any of you?
Just add something there.
Of course, please.
The complexity that you talk about is it's not just about this being a heritage building that is in continuous use and managing around the continuous use. That's one of the reasons why when we have the window every 4 years during the election cycle, so from November through to the end of April, there'll be a heck of a lot of work going on which will be very disruptive because it's the one time that we have that length of time. But it's also the complexity of the parliamentary environment and the nature of a parliament. President and I were recently at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Conference. One component of that was the meeting of the Society of Clerks at the table. There was an absolutely brilliant presentation by Matthew Hamblin, the former clerk of the House of Commons, currently still a clerk who's taken a career path into project management and has recently successfully project managed the restoration of Big Ben. And of course there's other restoration projects at Westminster. One of the things that was that we picked up from his brilliant presentation was just the difficulty of managing capital works projects, not only in a heritage environment, but because of the nature of Parliament. It's not a body where there is one chairperson and one CEO who can just make every decision. Everyone wants to be and needs to be consulted, but it doesn't matter how much you consult. There's always somebody who wants to be consulted more, and it doesn't matter what collective decision is made by the 2 presiding officers and the 3 department heads in this case. There'll always be someone who won't be happy with a particular decision, and everyone is equal. The 130 odd members of this place are all equal stakeholders, as are the people of New South Wales and everyone who works in this building as well. So it is a complex environment for managing heritage, but also continuous use and that sort of decision-making and consultation.
Thank you. I'll follow on, Mr. Webb, from your answer there. Is it fair to say that the heritage constraints affect the ability to keep this building fit for purpose as the Parliament of this state?
Yeah, look, I think that is...
You're angling for a new Parliament.
On the
I'm asking about the
Primrose
issues.
bandwagon.
Yeah.
On the Central Coast.
No, not at all.
Look,
That's
there are
reasonable, isn't it?
constraints. For instance, just to use an example I know has come up here before, having an accessible entrance at the front of the building is a good example. We have so far not been, besides the ramp that people currently use, we've so far not been able to find a solution that maintains the heritage value of the building and provides a way of someone going from the forecourt up to the balcony and straight in at level 7. We're continuing to look at the issue, but it's not. You can't just whack a ramp up the front of the building or put a chairlift in or things along those lines. So the heritage constraints do put constraints on things. You will have all seen that most parliaments across Australia have individual seating for members with microphones that are turned on and off by an operator based around the individual rather than the bench seating arrangements that we have at the moment. That puts constraints on how much technology we can deploy to support the operations that you're having. Now, offsetting that, we are in the oldest continuous use public building in Australia. There is great value in that. There is a history and a heritage to the building as well, which creates the atmosphere in which New South Wales Parliament operates. So I don't say any of that to say these are challenges we should not be trying to overcome. They should be, and that heritage and history is incredibly important. But it would be disingenuous of me to suggest that it makes my job easier for that to happen. It is a difficult array of things that we have to balance in order to try and keep things going. We're also a very small building, relatively speaking. So drilling in one part of the building can echo up through the whole building. So the effect of the work we're doing can also have. Whereas if you're doing some work in Federal Parliament House, for instance, if you're doing work on one side of the building, nobody in most of the building will even know that it's going on. So the fact that we're smaller we have a smaller footprint also creates constraints in the work that we do.
And I just might add, just to take the UK experience, we're talking about there when they went through an independent sort of styled process, quantify what it would cost and the imposition on the Parliament. We're looking at a £13 billion investment over 20 years and relocation of the Parliament to get the work done. So, you know, the heritage aspects are, you know, pretty serious, but you know, it's an institution that and the history and the tradition and the heritage are entwined with. So we need to make those sort of compromises and try and make it work as best we can.
Thank you. I think that'll do.
Yeah.
Opposition?
Opposition.
Thanks. I wanted to ask, at the last estimates hearing, Mr. Webb, we asked about the issue around who the PCBU, the person conducting the business or undertaking, is, who has the work health and safety duties in relation to members of Parliament. I understand that you'd received some council's advice in relation to the issues around staff. You were asked whether you could get an addendum to that advice in relation to members. Did you get that advice? What did it say?
Yes, and I probably just refer to my previous comments. It essentially said that the things haven't been tested, but there's a shared responsibility between members and the administration for the safety of staff in the Parliament. Would be my summary.
What about the specific question around members of Parliament? Who has the duty?
Right. Sorry. Yes.
To look after the
Yes.
work health and safety
I
members.
apologise. I misunderstood your question. Yes. Yes, that's the one for staff. But the for members, members are not employees of the Parliament. That's relatively clear. Yeah. Yes. Well. Yes, that's still about staff. So members are not employees of the Parliament, but they are, in a broad sense, employed by the Crown. In the most
Paid by the Crown.
yes, yes. Sorry.
By the Crown.
Well, sorry.
Where's the employment contract we have?
No, you're quite right. Sorry, paid by the Crown is a better way of putting it than employed by the Crown.
Exhausted by the Crown.
Yes, that's right. So as a result, the sort of PCBU responsibilities of the Parliament's administration don't apply to members. We're not the employers of any of you, and don't have the obligations that sit under that. And again, if I was to summarise, it's essentially, though, we still do have a responsibility to create as safe a working environment for you to work in as we can. So, for instance, the provision of you with equipment. We've had members asking for sit-stand desks, for instance, in order to maintain, be able to be safe. We do have an obligation to provide any equipment or resources or a built environment that allows you to do your work safely, but we don't have an employment relationship with you. So if you like, our responsibility is a more general one under from a work health and safety point of view, not the specific responsibility of an employer to their employee. If that
You have duties in relation to anyone who comes into the Parliament.
we do, yes, that's right. But because you work,
Covered by that duty as well.
yes, absolutely, and because you work in the physical space that we manage, though we do have more obligations than we would to a general visitor walking into the building. But it's not the relationship of an employer to an employee.
What about psychological hazards?
Noise. Quietness.
How do you deal with those?
I guess that would depend on those things that are something that we can control. So it would depend on the nature of the psychological hazard, I guess. If you want to give me an example.
Well, I mean, obviously bullying and harassment, which have come out of the Broderick report, are psychological hazards in a workplace that arguably is under your control, or the control of the presiding officers.
The aspects of it that...
How do you discharge your duty in that circumstance?
To a certain extent, doing things like reviewing circumstances, and the response we have to the Broderick Review will be in part us discharging our responsibilities under those spaces. But it's not clear cut when it comes to members, and it hasn't been tested. These responsibilities haven't been tested in any kind of court of law, so to a large extent the answer will depend on the specific circumstances of a case. So yes, we do have a responsibility to try and create a safe workplace, and that includes psychological safety in those spaces where we can influence psychological safety, absolutely. But for instance, the conduct of two members interacting with each other is not something that we have any control over, so we would not be in a position where we could affect that particular outcome. Decisions that the House make as a whole is another area. So, for instance, if we go to the broader safety issue, your collective decision recently to move to a 10 o'clock hard adjournment can be seen through the light of the House taking a measure to ensure the safety of the people within the House, which is all of you collectively. So that's another example where the administration, we couldn't have told you must move to a 10 o'clock hard adjournment. That, of course, would be entirely inappropriate. But by taking that decision, you have created a health and safety mitigation that would be based around fatigue and the like. So I know that I've just said in very many words, it depends, but it does depend on the circumstances.
The clerk might have something to say.
Just in terms of a member who may, if you're suggesting that a member may feel that they're in an unsafe workplace because of perhaps the contributions of a colleague in the chamber or committees. Now, of course, all members have absolute freedom of speech in debate. However, I would say that that freedom of speech is subject, of course, to the rules of the House. So the House sets those rules in a number of areas. Can't make disparaging comments in relation to the Crown or the Governor or other members, etc., except in accordance with the conventions of the House. But so that's just one example of a standing order that the House has put in place to constrain the words that members say in debate. So there's always opportunities for the House to continually review these things.
Can I just pursue this a little bit more, because we presumably paid for professional legal advice, and it sounds like it's a little bit ambiguous.
It is an ambiguous situation, yes.
I mean,
is the advice available to be tabled?
I don't know that we can without waiving professional privilege. Yeah, I'd have to take that on notice just to see that we wouldn't inadvertently cause an issue that we didn't mean to cause.
Did the advice go to the train of logic that says that if the ultimate governing body, if the Parliament's is the master of its own destiny, and therefore logic would dictate that the Parliament collectively is perhaps the PCBU, but then in a jurisdictional sense, what is the recourse? Did the advice go to that train of logic?
I would have to review it to see. I'm not... no, I can't recall off the top of my head. I'd have to take that on notice and go back and have another look. It's been a few months since I looked at the advice.
Okay, so if you could take that specifically on notice, because I think that's probably the nub of the issue. So you could, I mean, to go to one of your earlier examples, if there's, let's say there's an interaction in the hallway and someone stands over someone, you can imagine the Parliament coming up with a solution whereby, well, maybe an officer could be called to intervene to break up the dispute or whatever, then that's potentially a way forward, right?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I think that's I mean, if I'm going to the heart of advice, that situation dependency is incredibly important. Is there something that we could have done in that particular circumstances that would result in a safer workplace? and it depends on the circumstances. Two members have a dust up outside, decide to meet each other at the back of the building to sort things out.
Caucus room.
Yeah, that's right. That's completely outside of our control. I'd encourage you to consider the domain for your back of the building needs if that was to come forward. But you're right, if there were circumstances in which we could take either preventative action, and one of the things about not just the Broderick Review but others is we've been focusing on the reporting process and the like, but of course a large part of what we'll be doing is around the preventative space. I would prefer people to not have a bad experience in the first place rather than have a bad experience and then have to report it. So those things that are within our control, we have an obligation to exercise that. But there's a recognition, I guess, in the advice, there's a lot of stuff that's outside the administration's control. Might be the case that the House can self-regulate through standing orders and the like, as David, as Mr. Blunt just said. It could be a matter for an individual member to have made decisions about their own conduct in the building, or there could be things that we could do to either mitigate or ameliorate the impact of an event.
So just
Thank
two,
you.
just two
Thank you.
quick.
We're in Quest Crossbench time, and we're nearly
are we?
finished now. Well and truly.
Thanks,
Thank you,
acting,
Mr. Nathan.
acting Chair. I'm hearing some strange redefinitions of elected democracy. But does the executive group acknowledge the primacy of parliamentary privilege, that nothing can be done to prevent a member of parliament legitimately discharging their duties for the people they represent? I haven't heard those two important words, parliamentary privilege, mentioned once. Is that something you acknowledge in this thirst for behaviour control?
Mr. Latham, I thought I'd said exactly.
Breaking what law?
Mr. Latham, I thought I'd.
Parliamentary privilege is the law.
Let's let the clerk speak.
I thought I'd said exactly that. I had referred to members' absolute freedom of speech in debate. However,
You didn't say privilege.
well, the freedom of speech is one of it's the most fundamental.
Restraints on the movements,
It's the
the
most
activities, the
fundamental
thoughts, the
parliamentary
values of a member of parliament. That's outside privilege. Anyway, these things could well be tested in the future. Just turning away from Broderick and this emphasis on the heritage values at the front of the building. How does the frozen work on the frosted door fit into that, Mr. Webb? What's the heritage value of what you've done there with that hoarding inside the staff bar?
It's gone now.
It's gone now, replaced by what?
It was restored back to what it was before, and there are some display cabinets at the back.
Okay. And what's been the total cost to the Parliament of putting the hole in the wall, ordering the frosted door from overseas, leaving it on the dock in San Francisco, and then restoring the wall back to the way it was, that is, back exactly to the starting point?
I'll have to take the exact dollar figure on notice.
You acknowledge, though, it's been a complete fiasco and gives a lie to your pretense about heritage values and sound management of the building. It's an embarrassment, isn't it?
Well, I probably don't accept the premise of the question that I pretend to do my job, but besides that, it was a piece of work that we started in good faith, and when further decisions were made, we made best efforts to restore it.
And how much was your front of house proposal going to cost?
The full proposal that has that could have been. I'll get the exact figure on notice, but it was around
a lot of exactitude, except the stuff that's embarrassing.
Well, it was in the order of $1 million for the whole pieces of work. Yeah. But I'll have to get
to do what? What exactly is unsatisfactory with the way in which people enter and leave the building?
So it was the proposal has not gone ahead.
Not gone ahead. Okay then. Well, just on a few other things. Last time I was here at Legislature estimates in October, there was a promise that the Indigenous worker was actually going to venture west of the Blue Mountains and visit places with dreadful Indigenous problems like Burke, Moree, Bawarrina, Walgett, that the President and I have recently visited. Has that promise from estimates October last year been fulfilled?
Look, I'm not sure with the Aboriginal raising his exact movements, but I know that he's been doing a range of work, including assisting committees down the south coast, most recently in relation to the Indigenous fishing inquiry, and been doing some work with...
Still hasn't ventured west of the Blue Mountains. And is he working on the bicentennial celebrations?
He's doing some work in relation to the bicentenary, particularly in relation to assistance with consultation process, which the bicentenary has been engaging with Aboriginal groups across the state, and the Aboriginal liaison officer has been just very, very valuable in terms of developing those relationships.
Why hasn't he visited the places with the worst cases of Indigenous squalor and disadvantage and poverty and come back here with some recommendations on how to fix this?
I'm not sure where the Aboriginal liaison officer has gone or not gone. I could probably get some more information to you about that, but I know that he's been involved in relation to some of the committee work, in relation to the bicentenary itself so far as working up liaison with a number of those groups and some visits here in the Sydney area.
Okay, thank you. Just on your first line of defence against COVID, Mr. Webb, how often does that temperature checker at the security box actually identify someone who's got a high temperature and has to be excluded from the building?
Not often.
At all?
No, at all. Not
at all? It never has?
No.
Never has. So what you're saying is that for tens of thousands of people through the COVID period who've come into this building, and your first line of defence is this temperature checking, I think it needs to be if you're over 37 or something, not a single person has triggered that and had a fever, a temperature that would exclude them from the building. Does that indicate to you that the thing's not working?
Can I add that when I come in and it tells me I'm perfectly normal, I feel really grateful.
That's good. There is
I'm glad someone needs to tell you you're normal, but for those who are abnormal and have a high temperature, of which there must have been some in the tens of thousands that have entered the building, doesn't it indicate you that it's been another ridiculous joke?
It's the only time.
Well, we have tested the machines on multiple occasions to make sure that they work and continue to work, but I want to be completely upfront saying no, we haven't had an incident, and I would have probably...
Are you going to persist with this joke?
We're in the process of reviewing all the COVID recommendations.
Are you going to persist with the joke? Wouldn't any rational person say, well, obviously it's a waste of time, that it's been tested over several years? Tens of thousands of people come in, they stand in front of the stupid thing, tells you that you've got a normal temperature, and nobody has had a high temperature and been excluded from the building. Obviously, it's had no impact on anything to do with COVID or the flu or any other type of high temperature illness. Isn't that true?
Well, it may have resulted.
Why do you persist with fast for so long?
It may have resulted. Some people may have chosen to not come in because they knew their temperature would have been checked as they came through. But putting that aside, we are in the process of reviewing all of our COVID measures, and it could be that things that have been mandatory up until now may move to a voluntary service.
Have you got the same advice from New South Wales Health that's been circulated to the Department of Education, that in relation to the new Omicron strains BA4 and 5, any level of vaccination or prior infection has no impact on the transmission of infection?
Yes, I've seen some of that advice.
What sort of arrangement do we then have whereby in the advice you sent out on the 8th of August, members will continue to have full access to parliamentary precinct and should be fully vaccinated? Why are you sending out an advice about 4 jabs of the vaccine if the vaccine is making no impact whatsoever on the spread of BA4 and 5? Isn't this just another ridiculous joke?
Well,
and you're recommending a booster. A booster for what?
The health advice does not, unless the Department of Education receives something different than what I've said, it doesn't say that the vaccinations are useless. It said it does talk to, it has less effectiveness about transmission on, as you say, BA4
No, that's
BA5.
not what the Department of Education is circulating. Can you on notice
yes, I haven't seen what
table and circulate to this committee the latest advice you've got from New South Wales Health? It sounds like you're saying there's 2 sets of advice.
Well, I haven't seen what you're indicating that something specific has been circulated with the Department of Education. I have
at our committee.
I'm happy to have a look at that on notice.
Righto. And if you find out that vaccination has no impact on transmission, will you end this sort of advice about telling people to get a booster and also the HIBs, expensive HIBs testing that we have?
We haven't been using HIBs for quite some time, but you're talking about the nurses for, for the rapid antigen testing. Yes, of course. Can we announce the? Yes. So we have reviewed the rapid antigen testing, and after estimates finishes this week, we will be ceasing the mandatory testing going through. There will be the capacity. We do have stocks of rapid antigen tests, and people will be able to access those tests on a voluntary basis. So, for instance, if you want a test, we will have them available for you to do. And I'm also happy to. Your point about the temperature machines is a reasonable one, and so I'd be very happy to look at saying that moving that from being a mandatory step as you work in the building to something that people can use if it makes them, if it's a useful thing but is no longer mandatory as well. We are continuously reviewing. I should say on vaccinations, we don't just look at the transmission, we also look at the, from a work health and safety perspective, we also have to have regard to the effect that catching COVID could have on a person, and the vaccinations do.
Really, your responsibility. The health advice is that the unvaccinated are a danger only to themselves, and they've made that choice.
Yes, no, that
you're their nanny, and you're going to tell them how to run their health.
But in terms of all we're doing with vaccination at the moment is recommending that people get a booster, and I will continue to recommend that people should get boosted because I think it is a sensible precaution to take. It's just a recommendation that we're making to people. I'm not actually seeing that it's particularly controversial, but
well, it doesn't align with the health advice.
And I have undertaken.
As useful as the temperature checker, isn't it?
Thank you all so much. Thank you.
We have about 3 minutes left. So,
Can I just ask one very trivial thing in terms of operations? You know, when you enter the building and there is nobody here, how there is the little screen that puts up the picture, the image of yourself.
Yes.
Is it best? Is there a particular reason it is facing outward?
It's primarily facing. It's been positioned so the special constables can see it from most angles in the room. So there's something we're happy to look at. And you're right. For times when the special constables aren't actually in the
it should be facing inward, perhaps, or not outward.
That's a good suggestion. We'll definitely have a look at that.
It's a good point in terms of how it leaves it up as well. Like I know I've come in late, and I've noticed that you can see who came in before you.
That's right.
That's another good.
It could be a safety concern with that.
That's another good recommendation. So we'll definitely look at that. It's a relatively recent addition to the regime, so we can definitely tweak that. And I should say the crack squad. I asked the team over the break to tell me whether there's any whiz bang stair technology that we could utilise for your question earlier, and the indication is that there isn't, and the approach we take is pretty much the approach that all high-rise buildings take to that particular issue. So
Thank you.
Find the two biggest blokes and point them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wonder if there is because it certainly did deter. It was a consideration in what I could do in terms of having somebody come in. It was something I felt quite responsible for.
I think anyone working.
It's a disincentive, therefore.
Yeah, I can certainly understand that.
get the fireman in to conduct the fireman's carry.
Yeah.
Yes,
well,
that is the.
Whether or not that becomes part of our own first aid procedures or whatever, whether there's something we can do to be more proactive in terms of disability inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to look at those.
Thank you.
Issues, so.
On that happy note, I think we'll finish today's questioning, and
Did you enjoy your first lecture?
I'd encourage any members who have questions to some supplementary questions to the President, who will only be too happy to give us a detailed explanation of his trip overseas, which we didn't actually get down to.
Oh,
We've still got supplementary.
all on notice.
Absolutely. Well, I'm happy to take that notice in due course, but thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.